Chapter 530. The birth of estuary pigs means that the arrival of dragon pork is not far away. According to the information obtained by List and the pig farm manager, the original species of estuary pigs is a long-striped pig. This kind of pig is a fast-maturing breed that can generally mate in 6 months. In other words, by October this year, estuary pigs can mate and another batch of piglets will be born in January or February next year. Breeding pigs that are specially kept for breeding must not be eaten, but piglets crossed with ordinary long-striped pigs can of course be eaten. There will probably be piglets to eat in February next year. Very good dragon pork, I don't know what it will taste like. He secretly looked forward to it. At the same time he thought of the dragon cows. In Horse Town, half of the hillside of Needle Grass Hill has been set aside, alfalfa worm stalks have been moved, and alfalfa, the favorite food of cows, has been planted to build a bampo cattle farm. When the grassland is abundant, the dragon cows can be moved here. Next year the cows can be pregnant at the age of 2, and the year after that they can produce milk. The real dragon milk will also come. With the construction of the bampo cattle farm, the dragon cows also have a new name, bampo cattle. Estuary pigs and bampo cattle are all to conceal the dragon blood in them, plus the black blood horses of Black Horse Ranch. These are the dragon livestock owned by List. After inspecting the estuary pig cubs, he rode Loki around Black Horse Island to inspect the progress of all the new towns. At present, on Black Horse Island, the port town has begun to take shape. With the migration of a large number of industries, the town has become more prosperous and is not much worse than Flower Town. In particular, the increasingly large glass workshop accommodated more than 800 workers. On the other side, the Fire Dragon Brick Factory, which had been renamed the Black Horse Kiln Factory, had absorbed more than 1,300 workers. It had a pottery workshop, a brick workshop, a charcoal workshop, and a new material workshop, which continued to develop porcelain, cement, lime, etc. If it weren't for the magic of the fire dragon as fuel, the port town would now be full of smoke. Therefore, as an elemental dragon, the fire dragon's only output is probably to burn boilers. In addition to the port town, Newport Town has also begun to take shape. The new port has been built, and the shipyard has begun to refurbish old ships and reorganize the three-masted galleon Sunset. He also transferred some of the carpenters from the Flower Town's carpentry workshop and built a new sampan workshop here, specializing in the production of sampans for fishermen. In addition, Red River Town and Herding Horse Town had already taken shape, Grain Town had just started construction, Thorn Town had barely started construction, and Green Tea Town was still on the drawing board. Overall it was thriving. After a round of inspection, List returned to Port Town. The first thing he did was to check on the progress of the Wizard Tower. 2 of the 5 floors had already been built. Then he talked to Crazy Truth, who had moved the entire magic workshop here. He also took away this month's potions, mainly the Ice Flame Potion. List was very excited as he felt a whole box of Ice Flame Potions in the gem space. After the expansion of the Frost Flame Mushroom this year, despite the lack of manpower, there was still a good harvest. I can finally eat to my heart's content. These should be enough to support me and Charmander for 10 days. He silently calculated in his heart. At present, the Frost Flame Mushroom greenhouse had been expanded to 500 mu. In addition to the 150 mu of greenhouses in Flower Town, the rest were in the area south of Needle Grass Hill on Black Horse Island. The northern hillside was where the Bampo cattle farm was. 500 mu is still not enough. I have to expand another 500 mu of greenhouses as soon as possible to complete the new task. The Dragon Pig task was completed, and a new smoke task was released. Task: the harvest of the Frost Flame Mushroom slightly alleviates your need for potions. The importance of potions that do not require elves to cultivate can be seen. Please continue to expand the scale of the mushroom greenhouse to 1000 mu. Reward: Giant Algae Forest. List did not know what the Giant Algae Forest was. It sounded like a forest of algae on the bottom of the sea. There may be rich fishery resources in it. He had asked a Chi to try to pay attention to the giant algae when swimming in the sea. The giant algae forest must be in the sea, and he could only rely on a Chi to find it. 1000 mu of farmland was easy to grow crops, but 1000 mu of greenhouses was much more difficult to grow shiitake mushrooms. Shiitake mushrooms, including the variant flame mushroom and frost flame mushroom, required a high level of skill to grow. It was not something an ordinary serf could grow. Currently, there were no more than 300 people in his territory who could grow these 3 kinds of shiitake mushrooms. Of course, the flame mushroom was the only magic ingredient that List could get and quickly grow on a large scale. Therefore he invested a lot of energy in this area. He arranged for each of the 300 shiitake farmers to lead 10 apprentices. After teaching them he would lead more apprentices. In addition there was a division of labor. The shiitake farmers were responsible for the raw materials, temperature and management of the greenhouses, while the apprentices were responsible for the heavy work. Only in this way could new greenhouses be opened and more flame mushrooms could be grown. The frost flame mushroom could no longer be grown as the weather turned hot. Advisor Gort, the shiitake greenhouses must be expanded to 1,000 mu within half a month. The number of shiitake farmers also needs to continue to expand. I have decided to build a new town here, called Shiitake Town. It will specifically serve these shiitake farmers and become the main production base for my potions. Gort was already immune to List's whims. He nodded without hesitation. Sir, please rest assured I will transfer a group of officials to build Shiitake Town. You must take charge of this matter. The flame mushroom is very important to me. My lord, your cultivation concerns the future of all of our followers, so we definitely don't dare to be careless. You must know, as your follower, I am excited every day and have an unlimited fighting spirit. Even though I do not have your talent, but to be able to follow you to a great future, I have already surpassed too many territory knight. Such blatant flattery did not arouse List's disgust. Of course it did not feel too good either. Because Gort often flattered, List was also immune to it. He smiled and said, "You are my home teacher. A lot of my knowledge was taught by you. As long as you follow me with all your heart, I will definitely promise you a bright future." Gort immediately knelt on one knee and made a knight's salute. "Thank you, sir. Gort swears to be loyal to sir." "Get up. The territory needs you. Finish the construction of the shiitake greenhouses as soon as possible." Understood. After leaving Black Horse Island, List happily took potions with Charmander for 10 days. Charmander was so happy that it roared, "Oh roar," every day. List also obtained a lot of impurities to upgrade his dragon's fighting spirit. His strength steadily improved, getting stronger day by day. While he drank the pills he would often ride Loki back to White Birch City. His destination was the extinct volcano between Baihua City and North Valley City. The extinct volcano had no official name. It was a barren mountain similar to Thorn's Ridge. The local serfs called it the Missing Tooth Mountain because there was a big gap in the crater. From a distance, it looked like half of a tooth was missing. Arriving at his destination, he landed in the middle of the crater. List released Charmander and let it hover freely. He rode Loki and kept exploring around the crater. Chapter 531. Of course, the lava passage was not found. List cast magic eyes to find 2 sprite worms around, but he found nothing. The Deficient Fangs Mountain was an extinct volcano. Probably because it had been dead for too long, it had completely weathered into an ordinary mountain range. There was no trace of magma or even geothermal energy. There was no hot spring, no heat, no karst cave, just an ordinary mountain range. "Leo, let's go back," List shouted. The little fire dragon, which was hovering in the sky chasing the bird, suddenly swooped down and suddenly turned into a flame less than 3 meters away from List. It rushed into List's body and almost knocked List over. He took 2 steps back and stabilized his body. He immediately scolded the little fire dragon in his heart. "Steady yourself, how many times have you gone home? Be gentle." Brr. The little fire dragon responded, but without any emotion. It did not listen to what List said at all. It was not easy to train it like a blizzard beast. Perhaps the growth cycle of the dragon was too long. Although it was smart, the degree of adaptation was calculated in units of years. In short, after more than a month of training, the biggest change in the little fire dragon was that it accepted its new name, Leo. As for why List gave the little fire dragon this name, probably only List himself knew. Leaving the Deficient Fangs Mountain, List rode Loki and flew to the beach south of Coral Island. He went to see the intermediate World of Warcraft purple sand crocodile. The crocodile was leisurely basking in the sun on the beach. When it saw List's arrival, it immediately became alert and raised its head to make an attack posture. "I really want to kill it and eat its meat. Unfortunately, it's a bit embarrassing. I somewhat understand that the Count probably deliberately kept the purple sand crocodile to maintain Coral Island's World of Warcraft species. The relationship between humans and World of Warcraft on the continent is that if there is one, one will kill one. But in the Grand Duchy of Sapphire, isolated overseas, World of Warcraft is a rare species. Most of the time, World of Warcraft would be domesticated or protected in their habitats to allow World of Warcraft meat to continue to grow. List's previous method of wiping out all of Thorn's Ridge's World of Warcraft wasn't advisable. He did not know what the human in front of him was thinking. But the crocodile instinctively sensed danger. It opened its mouth and spat out a spell water wave shield. Instantly, a light blue circle of light enveloped it completely. Seeing this, List slowly unsheathed the sky cutter greatsword. The surging dragon's do chi circulated within his body, ready to strike. Boom. The first to attack was not List but the crocodile. The crocodile madly cast the spell water arrow volley. Countless water arrows flew towards List like sharp arrows. List leaped into the air, dodging the crocodile's magic. The sky cutter greatsword suddenly waved in the air, and a burning sunset flew out, turning into a line of fire that collided with the purple sand crocodile's water wave shield. Rumble. The purple sand crocodile's water wave shield couldn't withstand it at all. A second later it directly shattered. The high-grade fire attribute dragon's do chi that had not completely dissipated sprinkled on its purple luster scales, instantly burning the purple sand crocodile's scales. Goo goo. The purple sand crocodile let out a blood-curdling screech. It simply could not block List's sword. Of course, this could only be regarded as a flesh wound. Seeing its appearance, List gently landed on the ground and put away the sky cutter greatsword. He whistled to summon Loki, mounted him, and left the beach without looking back. He already felt his strength exploding. Ordinary World of Warcraft players would find it difficult to resist his charged sword. It was just a test of attack power. There was no need to kill the purple sand crocodile. I wonder how many of my swords the Count can block now? If the Sapphire Grand Duke came without relying on the Sapphire Dragon, and only relying on Dragon's Do Chi and Chi secret books, can I block 2 or 3 of his swords? The Sapphire family definitely has Chi secret skills that focus on lethality. Although I have 2 Chi secret skills, they are auxiliary. In terms of the Count, List's strength was already above that of all the Sky Knights. However, he could not measure a Grand Duke who might become a Dragon Knight. My current strength is probably still quite far from that of Marquis Bull. At the time, Marquis Bull fought dozens of Sky Knights alone. Although he was eventually forced to flee, but his strength after transforming into a lich was beyond doubt. List was now confident that he could crush 2 or 3 Sky Knights. If there were more, he could only flee. He was far worse than Bull. Of course. His strength was now in a period of rapid growth and he was improving every day. After all, he was a Dragon Knight who was about to ride a dragon. The confident Dragon Knight who had yet to ride a dragon. After returning to the Flower Town, his mood was no longer so cheerful. The reason was simple: his magic potions were out of stock again. The little fire dragon began to cry for potions, and his own cultivation began to slow down without the help of magic potions. It was a very uncomfortable feeling to abruptly cut off the upward momentum. It is now mid-April, about 5 or 6 months before the expansion order. I really want to rush directly to the Eagle Kingdom and plunder a batch of resources. It is best to capture 1 or 2 marquis and counts. I am afraid the ransom is enough for me to eat my fill. When there was no magic potion to take, List would always unconsciously have the idea of plundering. While restraining this greed, he could not help but sigh. No wonder there are wars every year. The resources consumed by the knight's cultivation always drive the nobles to compete with each other. Even a modern person like me who grew up in a peaceful era can't help but get involved. He endured. Night came. He went to the Seaview Villa and chatted with Achi. Achi suddenly mentioned an interesting thing. Brother, Achi found a big colorful fish on the Black Horse Island. It was like a beautiful colorful dolphin. It must be a sea monster. Achi wanted to catch up with it and catch it for my brother, but it swam very fast and got into a large area of seaweed. I couldn't find it. Colorful dolphin? What kind of sea monster is this? List's surprise at the colorful dolphin flashed, and then he focused his attention on another point. A large area of seaweed? Yes, there is a large area of seaweed under the sea, like a forest on the bottom of the sea. Achi went in and was dizzy. It is the first time that Achi has found so many seaweeds together on the bottom of the sea, and there are a lot of fish living in them. A large area of seaweed, a forest on the bottom of the sea. These 2 pieces of information were quickly reflected in List's mind, reminding him of the smoke mission. Without thinking too much, he immediately summoned the smoke mission. Sure enough, the content of the mission had changed. Mission completed. Reward: giant seaweed forest. About 1,000 acres of mushroom greenhouses had been built, so the new mission was immediately issued. Mission: the siren's keen sense of touch perceives the uniqueness of the giant seaweed forest, but she does not practice magic eyes and cannot see the essence. Maybe you need to explore it yourself and uncover the secrets of the giant seaweed forest. Reward: a sprite worm. There was a sprite worm lurking in the giant seaweed forest. It was probably the giant seaweed worm. Although he could not afford to develop the seabed planting industry for the time being, List still looked forward to every sprite worm. Achi, where did you find the giant seaweed forest? Achi thought for a moment and replied, it's about 500 meters away from the southeast corner of the Black Horse Island. The water depth is about 30 meters. There are many rocks on the bottom of the sea, and the giant seaweed grows on the rocks. It's like a rope extending to the surface of the sea, so dense that I can't see the end. Chapter 532. In the southeast corner of Black Horse Island, there is a bare beach with some scattered wooden houses. Although it is impossible to grow crops here, there are abundant seafood resources on the beach. The port town sampan fishing team often comes here to catch seafood to provide food for the territory. At this time List, wearing only leather armor and shorts, was sitting on a sampan and rowing to the sea. All his entourage stayed on the beach. He came to explore the giant kelp forest on the bottom of the sea alone. Because he needs to communicate with the siren Achi at all times, it is very inconvenient to bring his entourage. With Achi at the bottom of the sea, it was easy to come to the top of the giant kelp forest, hang down a rope, and let Achi fix the sampan. Before List was ready to dive to the bottom of the sea, he asked, Achi, although I can swim, it is difficult to exert my strength in the sea. After all, I have fire attribute Chi. I need you to guide me. Brother, don't worry, Achi will protect you just like I protect Achi. At present, the limit of my breath holding time is 15 minutes. In order to speed up the exploration, I need you to take me swimming. Okay. Achi swims very fast. If List swims by himself, he would probably spend more than half of the 15 minutes holding time swimming. There is not much time to explore the giant kelp forest. He took a deep breath. Crush. List jumped directly into the sea, followed the current manipulated by Achi, and quickly dived to the bottom. His strong physical fitness allows him to rely on Chi to slow down the use of oxygen. If the physical rules of the world are the same as those of the earth, and combustion and breathing are carried out using oxygen. In this world, ordinary people can probably hold their breath for a minute. It is normal for regular trained fishermen to hold their breath for 3 or 5 minutes. Any higher, one must rely on Chi. There is a trainee knight on Black Horse Island who often dives. He can hold his breath for 20 minutes and can hold his breath for 30 minutes when stationary. List hasn't trained much. The record for holding his breath with the help of Chi is 15 minutes, and he can hold his breath for 18 minutes when stationary. The sea is exceptionally clear. Although the field of vision is narrower than on land, it is still possible to see a long distance. Achi manipulates the water in the shell, wrapping him quickly to the edge of the giant kelp forest. Looking at it, the whole giant kelp forest really looks like a forest growing on the bottom of the sea. The giant kelp stretches straight to the surface of the sea, blocking the sun into fine light. Most of them are yellow or green. It looked a little like kelp. However, the giant seaweed had a trunk with many slender leaves that swayed left and right as the seawater flowed. Their roots gripped the rocks of the seabed, and many small fish swam between the giant algae. Sometimes the small fish would stir up the giant algae, entangling them together. There were also a large number of corals, sea anemones, and other creatures on the seabed. List was not in the mood to appreciate the beauty of the seabed. He quickly cast magic eyes and scanned the giant algae, but he did not find the light of mana retroaction. He patted Achi's shell. Achi understood and immediately controlled the water flow, bringing List with her as she swam towards the giant algae. However, they swam around the periphery of the forest on the offshore end. Magic Eye kept scanning, looking for possible worm stalks. 15 minutes passed in the blink of an eye, but he did not see any worm stalks. List floated to the surface of the water and took a deep breath. He then let Achi bring him to the next part of the giant algae forest. The giant algae forest on the seabed was indeed boundless, with no end in sight. Inside the giant algae forest, the light was poor and the field of vision was very short, which increased the difficulty of Magic Eye's observation. However, List's temperament was that once he did it, he would complete it. There was no reason for him to give up halfway. Once or twice he continued to search for more of the kelp forest. Finally, after 3 hours of searching, on his 9th dive, he saw the light he wanted to see. The light of chaotic colors was distributed on a giant algae more than 30 meters long. It almost reached the surface of the sea. Quickly swimming towards the giant algae, List quickly found the yellow-brown sprite worm entrenched at the roots of the kelp. Originally, List thought of letting Achi contract the giant algae worm, but since he had been working hard for so long, he might as well do it himself. Thereupon he took out jade powder and sprinkled it at the roots of the giant algae. The jade powder swayed a bit in the seawater and was not easy to adhere to. However, it still successfully attracted the giant algae worm, which slowly swam over and licked the jade powder. Next, while it was opening its mouth, List forcibly stuffed his finger into it. He took a bite. He felt a telepathic connection. He had already successfully contracted with the giant algae worm. He could feel the calm, tranquil, and relaxed mood of the little guy, as if he had transformed into a giant algae quietly stretching out in the sea. Together with the giant algae worm, he quickly floated to the surface of the water. Huff. He let out a long breath, inhaling the salty and fishy air on the surface of the sea. When a chi also emerged from the water and opened her shell, he directly threw the giant algae worm into a chi's shell and said, "A chi, take good care of this giant algae worm for me." Emichim. A chi's shell had practically become a small worm house for the sprite worm, following a chi around every day. "Let me rest for a while, then we will go back." List was lifted by the water current controlled by a chi to float on the surface of the sea and restore his strength. At the same time he called for a smoke mission. Mission complete. Reward, 1 giant algae sprite worm. 3 hours of hard work in exchange for a sprite worm was well worth it. The only regrettable thing was that the seaweed crops cultivated by the sea sprite worms were in the sea. The seaweed and seaweed grown by the kelp worm and seaweed sprite worms had already become food for the fishermen. However, the seaweed grown by the redstone flower worm, horsetail worm, and black hornworm had yet to be used. As for the giant algae worm, it was unknown whether the giant algae it represented could be eaten. If it could be eaten, the fishermen could come and catch it. In a trance, the serpentines composed of smoke distorted and reorganized the content. Mission: the giant algae sprite worm seems to be only a corner of the giant algae forest's secrets. This vast undersea forest is worth exploring further and deeper into the forest to fully unearth its secrets. Reward: a new species of giant algae. List was surprised. He did not expect that the giant algae forest mission was still not over. It seemed to be a chain mission. A new species of giant algae, what kind is it? Could it be a magic ingredient? Whether it was a magic ingredient or not, the exploration of the giant algae forest had to continue. It was already late in the morning, so he made an appointment with a chi to continue in the afternoon. List swam to the sampan and rowed to the shore. Surrounded by servants, he put on his frac abier and returned to the port town for lunch. After lunch he took a nap. The search continued. Chapter 533. List had already overestimated the size of the forest of giant algae as much as possible, but after diving underwater and exploring, List was still amazed by the size of the forest of giant algae. It was ridiculously large, and for the whole afternoon he and a chi were almost lost in the forest of giant algae. Fortunately, after unremitting efforts, List's magic eye finally found the light of mana retroaction, which was a whole piece of giant algae exuding the light of magic. Their appearance was almost no different from ordinary giant algae, perhaps a little smaller, but the whole body was still more than 20 to 30 meters long. One by one they were mixed among the ordinary giant algae. There was no doubt that this was the new secret of the smoke mission, the magic ingredient giant algae. And it was a lot of magic ingredient giant algae. Looking at the endless, dense magic ingredient giant algae exuding the light of chaos magic, List could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. Then he choked on the water, and a chi reacted in time to send him out of the water. But he still drank a few mouthfuls of seawater, and kept coughing on the surface of the sea. "Brother, are you okay?" A chi patted his back with concern, helping him to breathe. List stopped coughing for a while, floating on the water and gasping for breath, but his emotions were still resisting the wind. "I'm okay, I just choked on some water." "A chi, do you know what I found in the forest of giant algae? Its magic ingredient. There's a sea of giant medicinal algae. You can't see the end of it." Magic ingredient giant algae. A chi cheered. "Yes, it's the magic ingredient giant algae. Recently, I'm in urgent need of magic ingredients. The magic ingredients produced in the territory can't meet my needs, and it's also very difficult to buy them from outside. I didn't expect that the forest of giant algae you found would have so many magic ingredient giant algae." A chi was sincerely happy for him. "Great, brother can smoothly drink magic ingredient again." List smiled proudly. There was a burst of warmth in his chest. Obviously the little fire dragon had already felt his emotions, and understood that he would soon have magic ingredient to eat. List took a deep breath and motioned for a chi to continue to dive with him to determine the scope and number of the giant algae. Most importantly, he had to find a second giant algae worm. Apart from mushrooms and other types of sprite grass, as long as other plants have magic ingredients, they will also have sprite worms. The position of this magic medicine giant seaweed is already far away from the giant seaweed worm stalk ahead. This means that there is another giant seaweed worm hiding nearby. Diving. Search. Today was destined to be a day of harvest. Chi soon found a new giant algae and its worm stalk. Following this, List used the jade powder to successfully form a contract with the giant algae worm. After the contract, he was thrown into Chi's shell. The sea elves preferred the environment of the sea. Breaking through the seawater and floating on the surface, List was in a very good mood. The setting sun had already sunk into the horizon, and the afterglow dyed half the sky red. The seawater was also dyed red, as if large balls of flames were dancing on the surface of the sea. It's time to go back. Looking at the setting sun that was about to disappear, he smiled slightly. Tomorrow I will arrange for fishermen to come and fish up the magic medicine giant algae, as well as the non-magic medicine giant algae. Move the 2 giant seaweed worm stalks over to expand the growth range of the giant algae magic ingredient, so that the sea can cultivate more magic ingredients for me. He concentrated his mind a little. The smoke mission was quickly summoned. Mission completed. Reward, giant seaweed worm. Then he took a look at the new mission. The magic medicine giant seaweed is a huge discovery. It can effectively relieve the pressure on your magic ingredient demand. However, the area of the magic medicine giant seaweed seems to have exceeded the range of influence of the giant seaweed sprite worm. Please find other sprites affecting the magic medicine giant seaweed. Reward, 1 giant seaweed sprite. What? At first, List did not care about it. He thought that the 2 giant seaweed worms and the magic medicine giant seaweed from the giant seaweed forest were already very worthwhile. But he did not expect that the highlight was yet to come. Unexpectedly, there were still giant seaweed sprites hiding in the giant seaweed forest. He adjusted his breathing, suppressed his fluctuating emotions, and calmly said to Chi, "Have you noticed that the magic medicine giant seaweed seems to have exceeded the range of influence of the giant seaweed sprite worm?" Chi was very smart and immediately understood. Her big eyes shone. "Brother, are you saying that there are other giant seaweed worms here? Perhaps it is not only the giant seaweed worms, but also the giant seaweed sprites. This giant seaweed forest is really too big. It is unknown for how many years it has been growing. It is very difficult to determine how many sprites it has given birth to." The more List thought about it, the more he felt that his train of thought was correct. "Chi, there must be more sprites waiting for us to explore. Brother, should we continue the search? It is dark and the light is dim. It will be very inconvenient for me to dive again. There is no need to be impatient. Chi, let's go back first and continue the search tomorrow." All right. After returning to the port town, List had already sorted out how to deal with the giant seaweed forest. There was no doubt that when the magic medicine giant seaweed was discovered, it had changed from an interesting seabed plant to an indispensable strategic resource of the territory. I have Chi's help, so I can easily determine the area of the seaweed forest. But for the fishermen, it is difficult to distinguish the location of the giant seaweed forest from the area of the magic medicine giant seaweed. They do not have the coordinates to determine the location. So I need to help them determine the coordinates of the giant seaweed. He immediately ordered his servants to prepare ropes and a sampan. Using ropes to fix the sampan, they would mark the edge of the giant seaweed forest and the distribution area of the magic medicine giant seaweed. Of course, this was only a temporary measure. The best way was to learn from the seaside aquaculture on Earth and use floating balls to plan the aquaculture fields in the sea. They would harvest the magic medicine giant seaweed regularly and work hard to explore the cultivation techniques of the giant seaweed. Until now, we have not found out how big the giant seaweed forest is. Based on the area we have explored so far, this giant seaweed forest is very likely to have an area of tens of thousands of acres. Tens of thousands of acres? List and Chi had explored at most a small part of the area. So the next day, with ropes and sampan, he did not go into the water to search for the giant seaweed sprite. Instead, he busied himself with defining the boundary of the giant seaweed forest. He put down the sampan at intervals of 1 kilometer and had Chi fix it with ropes. He toiled until the night, using a total of 23 sampans to draw the boundary of the giant seaweed forest. Next, he rode Loki and surveyed the sky above the giant seaweed forest, drawing the positions of the sampans. He obtained the irregular shape of the giant seaweed forest. Then he drew it on thick bast paper and roughly calculated it. It was concluded that the area of the giant seaweed forest might reach 24 square kilometers, or about 36,000 acres. This area was equivalent to the area of the flower town. It's really huge. Next, I should look for the giant seaweed sprite and determine the scope of the magic medicine giant seaweed. After finding the giant seaweed, he should send someone to retrieve it and then send it to the magic workshop to have Chris Truth make it into a magic medicine. There were no magic medicines to take. Chapter 534. As a powerful Sky Knight, List's body's adaptability was very strong. The day before yesterday he could only hold his breath for 15 minutes, but now he could hold his breath for 25 minutes. While searching for the giant seaweed, he was pleasantly surprised because the distribution of the giant seaweed far exceeded his imagination. At first, he thought that only one giant seaweed sprite could influence an area of more than 100 acres, and then another sprite could influence an area of more than 800 acres. Now it had already reached more than 1,000 acres, and there was still no end in sight. According to the normal distribution of sprites, a large sprite can influence an area of about 6,000 acres, a lesser sprite can influence an area of about 800 acres, and a sprite worm can influence an area of about 100 acres. In other words, a sprite can influence an area of no more than 960 acres, while a sprite worm can influence an area of no more than 120 acres. 960 acres plus 120 acres was equal to 1080 acres. In other words, under the influence of the currently known sprites, the area of the giant seaweed in the giant seaweed forest would not exceed this value. However, after covering an area of more than 1,000 acres, List was still unable to explore the edge of the giant seaweed forest. There are still sprites. There are definitely sprites. This is really amazing. How many surprises will this giant seaweed forest bring me? List, who was inspecting the light of mana retroaction underwater, became more and more excited, feeling that he had really made a fortune this time. The blue sea, which he had high hopes for, did not disappoint him. Wild magic ingredients grew in large patches. At this time, a chi suddenly led him to swim towards a giant seaweed, and then she pointed at its root. Suddenly, a yellow-brown giant seaweed worm was resting on the leaf stalk of the root. Another sprite worm. Without hesitation, List took out jade powder and sprinkled it into the water to attract the giant seaweed worm. He then extended his finger and let it bite him. Their minds were connected and the contract was successful. The third giant seaweed worm was obtained. The appearance of this giant seaweed worm was a pleasant surprise, but it did not disrupt List's search for the giant seaweed sprite. With a chi's help, he continued to search for the giant seaweed magic ingredient and identify the giant seaweed worm stalks. Worm stalks mixed in the giant seaweed were very difficult to find. After all, they all emitted the light of mana retroaction. In the end, he still had to rely on a chi's keen observation. She patted List's shoulder and pointed to a patch of giant algae in front of them. List looked in the direction of her finger and vaguely saw a spot of light that was different from the others. He dispersed his magic eyes and looked with his naked eyes, finding that the light spot was behind the leaves of a giant algae. Although he couldn't see it clearly, it was definitely an elf. List hurriedly motioned for a chi to take him to swim towards the little elf, but as soon as they swam over, the little elf nimbly escaped and left the giant seaweed. Wild elves are very vigilant. Only wild elves like Nami, the mangrove elf, can't move when they see a chi, so they take the initiative to sign the contract. This giant algae sprite was different. It didn't have the slightest intention of approaching a chi. In the blink of an eye, it disappeared without a trace. Go up. List gestured for a chi to surface. He breathed in and recovered his energy. He said, "Take me to the giant seaweed later. I have already observed that this is the giant algae sprite's worm stalk. Its root is very thick, not much smaller than a bucket. Although it is curving and hovering under the sea, its length is definitely more than 60 or 70 meters. Brother, but the giant algae sprite can run. I will lure it with jade powder, see if I can attract it, and then take the initiative to contract it. If it doesn't work, you need to control the water to bind the giant algae sprite, and then I will contract it." Okay. Achi nodded. Although she was kind and innocent, she didn't have the mentality of, "How can I hurt a cute little elf?" In fact, the law of the jungle often happened when she was growing up. Murumida's pursuit was not an exception. She was often hunted by sea monsters when she was a child. Therefore, List's method of dealing with elves was very normal, and his behavior of hunting sea monsters was also reasonable. She probably wouldn't object even if List asked her to kill people. Her concept of good and evil was more or less different from that of human beings. Besides, if she often stayed with List, it was inevitable that she would be influenced by him, Ahem, she would be influenced by him. A moment later, List had fully recovered. He returned to the root of the giant algae sprite, took out the jade powder and sprinkled it. The jade powder would flow with the current in the sea and sink to the bottom, but because of its specific gravity, a lot of it would still stick to the worm stalk. He didn't know how the jade powder attracted the elves, but the elves liked jade very much. As expected. After waiting for no more than 3 minutes, List found that the giant algae sprite that had escaped was carefully groping back. It hid behind the giant algae leaves and quietly approached, but it didn't know that the magic light on its body had already exposed its position. List also pointed out its position for Achi without batting an eyelid. Achi nodded. She was ready to catch it. Only then did List easily take out another handful of jade powder and sprinkle it at the position of the giant algae sprite. The jade powder couldn't be scattered far in the water. But the smell it emitted successfully attracted the giant algae sprite. 2 minutes later, it openly appeared in List's sight and shrank back. It repeated this 2 or 3 times before it began to approach List and lick the jade powder that was sprinkled on the giant algae sprite. From time to time, it turned its head and looked at List, opening its mouth and letting out vague sounds. That sound was similar to Guru. It was also yellow-brown and sparkling like a crystal, and there was a super small algae the length of a finger on top of its head. Its big eyes were full of spirit, but the teeth in its mouth were very sharp, which added a hint of fierceness to its beauty. It didn't have wings, but there were transparent fin-like structures on its ears, armpits, calves and tail. Obviously, the structure of the sprites in the sea was very different from that of the sprites on land. List didn't disturb it. He just looked at it with great interest, letting it eat up the jade powder on the giant algae. Then he took out another handful of jade powder, put it on his hand and slowly stretched it towards the giant algae sprite. If it was a human, even a kindergartner wouldn't fall for this kind of rough seduction. But the other party was just a giant algae sprite. It tilted its head and thought for a dozen seconds, then bared its teeth and quickly swam over, hugged List's hand and began to lick the jade powder. List took advantage of its unpreparedness and quietly stuck his middle finger into its mouth. The sprite reacted and opened its mouth to bite. It was very painful. It directly bit List's finger until it bled, but the contract was also completed in an instant. The moment their minds were connected, List could still feel its vigilance, nervousness and ruthlessness. But this feeling was soon replaced by puzzlement and affection. The giant algae sprite was probably confused. Why did this annoying guy make me feel so intimate? Little guy, I finally caught you. List operated the dragon's fighting spirit to stop the bleeding on his finger, and then held the giant algae sprite in his palm. He motioned for Achi to send him to the surface of the water. The giant algae sprite was a little unhappy. It didn't like to leave the water. Chapter 535. The grumbling giant algae sprite became the 4th sprite under List's command. Its arrival represented the huge giant algae magic ingredient. With 3 giant algae sprite worms and 1 giant algae lesser sprite, I can cultivate at least 1,100 mu of magic ingredient giant algae. List looked at the giant algae lesser sprite hanging from his arm and swaying along with the waves, feeling elated. The giant algae sprite's temper was clearly not so mild. It also did not have a favorable impression of Achi like Nami. When Achi was about to touch it, it twisted its body to avoid her, turned its head and bared its teeth at Achi. Grumble. It was warning Achi not to touch it. Little guy, this is a siren, understand? When I am not in the sea you will follow it, understand? Grumble. Don't grumble, she also has your favorite jade powder. List gave Achi a meaningful glance, hinting for her to take out some jade powder. Sure enough, Milk was mother. After Achi took out the jade powder, the giant algae sprite did not hesitate for more than 3 seconds before rushing over and eating the jade powder Achi fed it. When Achi reached out to touch it, it showed no reaction, just like when List had tempted it. It simply could not resist the temptation of the jade powder. Fortunately, after contracting with a sprite, if it does not take the initiative to terminate the contract, others cannot contract with it a second time. Otherwise, it would have been abducted by others in less than 3 days. List no longer paid attention to the giant algae sprite that was eating the jade powder and exclaiming, delicious. Instead, he focused his attention. He summoned the smoke mission. Mission completed. Reward, 1 giant algae sprite. Then a new mission arrived. Mission, the giant algae forest has not been fully explored. In fact, you have only uncovered a corner of the forest and have yet to explore its core secrets. Achi is a good helper. Why not let her help you dive deeper and find more secrets? Reward, 1 Low-ranking dragon species sea monster. Low-ranking dragon species sea monster. What's going on? Ever since I got the smoke mission and obtained the smoke dragon's power of fate, I seem to have become fated with dragons and dragon-type life forms. Dragon-type creatures included wyverns, subdragons, draconic beasts and dragon-type beasts. List had contact with the wyvern, including the light dragon of the Grand Duchy of Maple Leaf. Paris was the black dragon of the light dragon. The sapphire dragon, the guardian dragon of his country which he had met once on Iron Hoof Island. The smoke dragon which he had not met, but the smoke dragon was always there. The invisible dragon had met him twice and sent him 4 space gems. They belonged to his old friends. Finally, there was the dead fire dragon on Black Horse Island, and the little fire dragon, Leo, who was born from the remains of the fire dragon. All day long he was shouting, "Oh roar," and "Oh roar" to take potions. He had only come into contact with one viper, and the situation was a little unclear. Marquis Merlin had given him a phoenix feather, but it was swallowed by Charmander before it could warm up. After that, List wrote another letter to Marquis Merlin, inquiring about the situation of the phoenix feather. He learned that this phoenix feather was seized from the Taro family's expansion order, and there was only one of it. Dragon beast. Loki was a dragon beast. Dragon-type wild beasts such as Bampo cattle, estuarine pigs and black blood horses. Now there was another low-level dragon-type sea monster. Sea monsters were a type of World of Warcraft, and this could also be regarded as a dragon beast. The dragon beast in the sea, I wonder what kind it is. Is it a fish or a whale or maybe a crab, lobster, shell or starfish? In any case, the exploration of the giant kelp forest was still not complete, and even the range of the giant kelp magic ingredient had not been determined. There were still sprites in this underwater forest. There was even an even more explosive secret. However, there was no time to search today. Unknowingly, the sun had already set on the sea. List was ready to take the giant kelp sprite back, but the giant kelp sprite was unwilling to leave the sea. If it was just a sprite worm, then he could take it away. However, it was a sprite with independent thinking, and could no longer be simply regarded as a farming tool. Then you will spend the night with a chi. List did not force the giant kelp sprite to leave the sea. However, he had already planned to build a sea worm house in the canal below the castle that connected to the sea when the new castle was built in the future, so that the sea sprites could be sheltered. Before parting, a chi who was holding the giant kelp sprite suddenly asked, "Big brother, what are you going to name this giant kelp sprite?" A name? List pondered for a moment and then made a decision. Let's call it Fitz. The meaning of the name is tidal spirit. It is a sea sprite born along with the tide. Fitz. Achi did not comment on the name. She was concerned about the other information in List's words. Big brother, since Fitz and the others are sea sprites, then what is a chi? Big brother, you said that a chi is a sea sprite. When she asked this question, the little siren was somewhat disappointed. Originally, the title of sea sprite was her exclusive possession. List smiled and gently stroked Achi's beautiful blue hair. Achi, you are a siren and sirens are sea sprites. Fitz and the others are farming sprites. They just live in the sea and have no direct connection with the sea. Yahi. She said goodbye to List. Achi took Fitz and continued to swim in the giant kelp forest. She was a siren, and the sea was her place to roam freely. She was going to continue to search to see if she could find new sprites to reduce List's workload. At this moment, her eyes blurred. A big colorful fish swam through the giant kelp forest. Achi's eyes suddenly lit up. It's that big dolphin. She had found the giant kelp forest by chasing this dolphin-like sea monster. But in the end, the sea monster ran away and she failed to catch it. At this time, she directly followed it and decided to hunt the sea monster again. With the help of the giant kelp, Achi's big white shell quietly followed the sea monster from afar. The relaxed sea monster did not find her and swam around leisurely, occasionally chasing the surrounding fish. It completely regarded the giant kelp forest as an amusement park, happy and content. Little did it know that danger was approaching. However, just as Achi was about to attack and kill the sea monster, she suddenly stopped and hid behind a few giant kelps. She did not expose herself and quietly observed. In her vision, the dolphin-like sea monster seemed to want to attack a giant kelp. However, before it got close, a faint yellow light flashed on its body, and then tiny giant kelps grew out of its skin and wrapped around it. The sea monster had to rush to the rocks next to it and scrape off the giant kelps. Then it unwillingly circled around and wanted to attack again, but was blocked by the yellow light several times. In the end, its body was covered with giant kelps, and it unwillingly swam into the depths of the giant kelp forest. "It's a giant kelp sprite, a giant kelp sprite." Achi was very surprised. She had just contracted a giant kelp sprite with List an hour ago. She did not expect to meet another one. The clever Achi immediately remembered that List had said that the magic ingredient giant kelp forest was very large and had not been completely explored. So it was not surprising to find another giant kelp sprite. She firmly remembered the position of this giant kelp sprite's worm stalk, and then chased after the colorful sea monster. Unfortunately. Chapter 536. The rainbow-colored dolphin sea monster disappeared, leaving Achi a bit anxious. She was not anxious because she could not kill it, but rather because she was afraid that the sea monster would find other sprite worms and eat them. At present, 3 sprite worms and 2 lesser sprites had been found in the kelp forest. It was difficult to guarantee that there would not be other sprite worms. The entire kelp forest sprites belonged to her big brother List. They could not be defiled by the sea monster. After carefully searching around, she still could not find any trace of the sea monster. She could only comfort herself. This sea monster should not be targeting the sprites. It might just be curious about the sprites. I have never heard my big brother say that there are animals that feed on sprites, nor have I read about it in books. Moreover, finding a sprite worm was very difficult. The sea monster might not be able to find a second sprite. Sea monsters do not have magic eyes. She gently swam among the kelp, feeling a bit regretful. Unfortunately, Achi is not a knight and has no chi, so she cannot cultivate magic eyes. Otherwise, Achi could help my big brother quickly find all the sprites and potions in the sea. Magic eyes was Achi's secret skill that could only be cultivated by a knight. Wizards naturally could not cultivate it. After searching around, the sky was completely dark. She returned to her previous position and observed the new kelp lesser sprite for a moment, before leaving the kelp forest and swimming towards Mangrove Island. On Mangrove Island, Nami was holding a newly hatched mallard, waiting for Achi's return. Sometimes Achi would take Nami with her, but because she had to raise the ducklings, Nami now spent half of her nights on Mangrove Island. She also liked Mangrove Island very much. After all, it was born here. Seeing the shell float up from the mangrove forest, Nami immediately put down the ducklings and happily flew up, shouting "tweet" as she rushed towards the shell. When Achi flew out of the shell, it just happened to rush into her embrace. "Nami, Big Brother List has brought you a new companion." Tweet. Gulu. Without needing Achi's introduction, Fitz emerged from the shell and bared his teeth at Nami. His sharp teeth instantly scared Nami into hiding in Achi's bosom. "Fitz, you are not allowed to scare Nami." Gulp. Fei-Zi turned his head and bared his teeth at Achi. Even though he was a mother, it didn't mean that Fei-Zi would submit to Achi, unless she took out the jade powder. Slurp slurp. After getting the jade powder, Fitz no longer provoked Nami. He just quietly licked the jade powder. Nami also plucked up her courage and began to look at Fitz. She even chirped at Achi from time to time. Achi explained in a low voice, "It doesn't have wings because it's an elf in the sea. Elves in the sea have fins but no wings. Look at its fins. Don't they look similar to Achi's fins?" There were also transparent fins behind Achi's ears and back. In fact, the spirits of the sea and the spirits of the sea were very similar. After a while, Fitz had already finished eating the jade powder. When he saw Nami looking at him, he began to grimace. However, Nami, who already knows that it can't fly, is no longer afraid of it. It turns around and flies away. In the blink of an eye, he took out 2 peanut nougats from the leaves of his worm stalk. Chirp. She handed a peanut nougat to Fitz. Gulp. Fitz was stunned. He sniffed and then reached out to take the peanut nougat. Seeing Nami stuffing the peanut nougat into her mouth and chewing on it, she also did the same. However, after eating 2 mouthfuls, he spat out the peanut nougat and threw away the candy in his hand. He grimaced again. Nami pursed her lips and turned back to communicate with Achi with chirp. Then Achi took out some jade powder and handed it to him. She immediately grabbed the jade powder and flew to Fitz for the second time. The next scene was as expected. Fitz, who was eating the jade powder, didn't resist Nami at all. He let Nami touch the small giant algae on his head. Achi watched from the side and felt it was very interesting. Nami was really a smart elf who was good at making friends. Another kelp sprite? Early the next morning, after meeting with Achi, List was shocked. As I expected, there are too many elves hidden in this giant algae forest. By the way, can you find the colorful dolphin you mentioned? I'm very interested in it. If you can catch it, try not to kill it. After being surprised by the elf, He began to suspect that the colorful dolphin was probably a low-level dragon-type sea monster mentioned in the smoke mission. The colorful big fish looked like a dolphin, which was very suitable for a dragon-type beast. The chocobo Loki also had colorful feathers. Anyway, a new day of searching began. First, he let Achi take him to the place where the giant algae elf's worm stalk was. The same routine, the same result. The greedy giant algae elf couldn't resist the temptation of the jade powder at all. List took the opportunity to stretch out his finger and kiss it successfully. After emerging from the water, List was very proud. Achi, these elves are really tempting. Brother, if it's Nami, it won't be so easily tempted. Achi told him in detail how Nami became friends with Fitz yesterday. Really, Nami is so cute. But I don't agree with you. Maybe I don't need to contract with her. Nami will take the initiative to approach me and then contract with me, just like she took the initiative to contract with you. Achi was stunned. Suddenly she felt that it might be true. Nami was an elf who liked to make friends. Just as they were talking, a fight suddenly broke out in the shell. It was Fitz and the new giant algae elf. They didn't like each other, so they directly fought in the water, punching and biting each other. It was a very fierce fight. Stop. List immediately stopped them. The two elves didn't dare to disobey, but they still stared at each other and bared their teeth. Although they were born in the same giant algae forest, and their species and appearance were similar, the two little guys were obviously not gregarious. They dared to fight as soon as they met. What a short temper. From now on you are not allowed to fight, let alone bully any elf. Do you hear me, Fitz, and you? I'll call you Tam, meaning River King. As for why you have this name, seeing that you have a bad temper, you will definitely be a tyrant of the Castle Canal in the future. Fitz and Tam continued to stare at each other. Due to the power of the contract, they could not refuse List's orders and did not dare to fight again. Time ticked by and a day came to an end. The magic ingredient giant algae's range was finally determined. It was about 250 hectares in size. Of course, not every hectare was filled with magic ingredient giant algae. There were also many ordinary giant algae mixed in. The output of these magic ingredient giant algae was definitely not lower than the output of the fast-growing magic thorns. List observed with magic eyes that the magic ingredient giant algae was not only huge, but also had a high concentration of magic power. The amount of magic ingredient extracted from a single plant was incomparable to that of ordinary magic ingredients. Achi, we still need to continue searching in this magic ingredient giant algae. According to my calculations, there should be at least 2 sprite worms here. Moreover, I already have a rough estimate of their general location. Previously, List, riding on Loki, carefully drew the distribution range of the magic ingredient giant algae as well as the location of 3 of its worm stalks. According to the location of the 3 worm stalks, he drew a circular range and found that it was impossible to cover all of the magic ingredient giant algae. He carefully calculated the range that was not covered by the worm stalks and came to the conclusion that only 2 sprite worms' worm stalks could satisfy the distribution of the magic ingredient giant algae. This was a scientific calculation. The accuracy was very high. Chapter 537. The kelp forest is distributed in a long strip, with a total of about 36,000 acres, but the west end of this strip is close to the sea and the east end is far away from the sea. List's current exploration area is the west end of the sea, about 1/3, that is, about 12,000 acres, of which 2,500 acres is about the distribution range of the potion giant algae. Further to the east, the water depth has gradually reached 80 meters, the bottom of the sea is rugged, and some places even reach more than 100 meters deep. The fish living in this part of the kelp forest are getting bigger and bigger, and there are even fierce predators such as sharks lurking on the bottom of the sea. Of course, even under the water, List Chi is not flexible enough, but he can still easily kill fierce sharks, not to mention the help of the water magician A Chi. As long as there are no sea monsters, he is safe on the bottom of the sea. The eastern end of the kelp forest is not suitable for mariculture. The water is too deep and there are sharks. It is very dangerous for ordinary fishermen to come here to harvest giant algae. Even if the territory promotes chi, ordinary fishermen may have chi in the future, it is still dangerous. The territory of the night is the land and the sky. The sea is not within the scope. Even the water attribute night will be tied in the sea and will drown if he is not careful. Not only the night but also the magician cannot conquer the sea. Human flesh and blood are not naturally suitable for action in the sea. Whether it is a dragon knight or a magic shooter, they will suffer when they go into the water. This is also the reason why the Grand Duchy of Sapphire is tirelessly attacking the mainland. Even island countries have difficulty conquering the sea, let alone those on land countries. Without the existence of the siren Chi, Liszt would also find it difficult to develop the sea. At least before technology has developed to the point of underwater work, the sea is synonymous with danger. Even on the Earth in the age of technology, human beings cannot completely conquer the sea. In the face of the sea buried with countless resources, they can only stare. There are only a few countries that can exploit oil in the sea. However, Liszt has the siren Chi and the sea is no longer so mysterious. It will take a lot of time to explore the kelp forest. Today we will develop the potion giant algae. I have redesigned the placement of the giant algae worm stalk. In the future, the planting area of the potion giant algae will gradually move to the sea. You are underwater, cut off all the potion giant algae in this part of the area, let them surface, I will send fishermen to fish. Yes. Chi was a good siren who worked hard without complaint. She would never refuse a task assigned by Liszt. Watching her swiftly sink to the bottom of the sea, Liszt was deeply moved. Among the many rewards that the smoke mission had brought him, the most important one was a Chi. Even the little fire dragon Leo couldn't compare to a Chi in his heart. If he had to choose one to give up, he would rather give up on Leo. Of course, this thought would not be revealed to Leo. Otherwise, if Leo got angry, he might really fly away. It was hard to say. With Liszt serving him well, he might not be willing to leave. The harvesting of the giant algae soon began. Nearly 600 acres of magic algae were not within Liszt's scope of planning and could be cut down. It was not difficult to distinguish between giant seaweed and giant seaweed. Those with slender leaves were giant seaweed, while those with slightly thicker leaves were ordinary giant seaweed. There was no doubt about Chi's ability to work. Soon there were huge groups of yellow-brown giant seaweed floating on the sea. The Black Horse Islands dinghy fishing team had developed to more than 300. Liszt transferred 100 of them to search for the giant seaweed drifting on the sea and transport it to the shore. Then a serf loaded the giant seaweed into a car, took it to the magic workshop in Port Town, and handed it over to Chris Truth. It was inevitable that Chi had cut the ordinary giant seaweed by mistake in a hurry, but the magician had a way to distinguish between magic algae and ordinary plants. Liszt did not forget to tell the official in charge of the transportation, "Don't throw away the ordinary giant seaweed that was cut wrongly. Send someone to find out if it is edible and if there is any other value that can be used." 36,000 acres of giant seaweed, if it could not be eaten or used, it would be a waste. Preparing to harvest 600 acres of magic herbs, only Chi was constantly harvesting, and the speed was not fast. Liszt also dived underwater and harvested as many magic herbs as possible. His ability to hold his breath underwater was getting stronger and stronger. Now he could swim underwater for 25 minutes without breathing. This was without Chi controlling the water flow to help him, which showed his rapid progress. He first followed the giant seaweed plantation plan he had been working on last night. He brought along the 2 giant seaweed fairies and 3 giant seaweed sprite worms that he had already contracted to migrate the worm stalks. He moved as far as possible to the offshore area, and made sure that the range of the worm stalks did not overlap with each other to maximize the planting area. Then he chose a place with a water depth of no more than 20 meters and delimited an experimental field. He experimented with the growth, harvesting, and reproduction of the giant seaweed. Based on his understanding of algae, it was a very primitive plant, and some algae could not even be called plants but primitive creatures. But in this world, most algae could breed sprite worms, so it was naturally classified as a plant. He had observed kelp before. There were small bumps on the leaves of kelp. The small bumps on the leaves of a mature kelp would break, and there would probably be kelp seeds inside. He had asked Chi to test it. When a section of mature kelp was buried in the mud, kelp seedlings would soon germinate. The giant seaweed was probably similar to kelp, and could also reproduce in this way. Moreover, with the help of Fitz and Tam, it was much easier for him to reproduce the giant seaweed. He could let the sprites reproduce on their own using the jade powder as the driving force. Sprites had the magic of planting. For example, Ella could casually plant thorns, Nami could casually plant mangroves, Mickey could casually plant corn, and Fitz and Tam could casually plant giant seaweed. However, sprites were not professional farmers, and when they planted, they scattered the giant seaweed regardless of the quality, density, or location. After scattering, they would not take care of the giant seaweed, which required manual management. In particular, during the seedling stage, the sprites scattered by the sprites varied in strength, and many of them were unqualified. Artificial selection of seeds was more qualified. The only pity was that the sprites could not distinguish between magic herb seeds and ordinary seeds. In essence, magic herbs still had to be artificially bred. Now, the giant seaweed planting was not urgent. Liszt mainly experimented with the harvesting and growth of the giant seaweed. He cut off 10 meters, 20 meters and 30 meters of different parts of the giant seaweed in the experimental field, leaving the remaining giant seaweed of different lengths to see if they would die or continue to grow. If they could continue to grow, then the giant seaweed could be harvested batch by batch. If they could not continue to grow, then he would have to breed seedlings. In the evening, Liszt met up with Achi, who had been busy all day, and received good news. Brother, Achi found another giant seaweed sprite worm while harvesting the magic herb giant seaweed. Is that so? Take me to it. Diving, finding the sprite worm, sprinkling jade powder to seduce it, and the contract was naturally successful. So far, he had obtained 2 sprites and 4 sprite worms from the giant seaweed forest. It was like running into a nest of sprites. Moreover, there were still 2/3 of the giant seaweed forest waiting for him to explore. There were more secrets in the smoke mission, and it might really be the big sprite that he was looking forward to. Chapter 538. Lord Viscount, the giant seaweed you found in the sea is really unbelievable. There are actually magic potions in the sea, and there are even elves living there. Night. The magic workshop was lit with crystal lamps. There were 4 crystal lamps installed in the workshop alone, illuminating every corner. These crystal lamps were all provided by Liszt. He had given many crystals to the crystal craftsman, Brad, to carve and then make magic equipment. Among them were more than 30 crystal lamps. Chris Truth was refining the magic juice of the giant seaweed while talking to Liszt, who came to inspect. This is a very amazing discovery. Unfortunately, I can't swim, otherwise I would really like to go to the sea and see the giant seaweed forest you mentioned. Every giant seaweed is so huge, the giant seaweed forest must be extremely magnificent. It is indeed magnificent, but the view in the sea is relatively narrow. In addition to looking magnificent, it also looks a little gloomy. Yes, sometimes when I sail on a boat and look at the deep blue, I can't help but feel fear in my heart, as if the sea will swallow me at any time. This is deep sea phobia. Liszt said with a smile. The deep sea has all the factors that make people afraid. Ferocious sea monsters, unknown creatures, oppressive colors, unknown climate, far away from the mainland, isolated and helpless. The vast waters of the vast sea, drowning at any time, all these can lead to deep sea phobia. In summary, there was only one sentence. God knows what was under the water. Chris did not quite understand. Is this an illness? It's not an illness, just a psychological effect. A fear of the unknown. As long as you face it hard, you can basically overcome it. It seems that I should learn how to swim. Yes, as an islander, it's a bit unreasonable not to know how to swim. Liszt did not continue on this topic. After a few idle words, he went straight to the point. How is the magic potion production of the giant seaweed? Compared to the magic potions on land, is it better? If we look at magic potions of equal weight, the production of the giant seaweed is not excellent, and the magic it contains is relatively thin. However, a single giant seaweed is tens of meters long and can be used to refine several potions. I'm afraid I won't be able to do it alone, Lord Viscount, if you send too many giant seaweeds. Is that so? Then I will stop harvesting tomorrow. I will continue harvesting when you are free. Yes, I estimate that this batch of giant seaweed will keep me busy for 3 days. I should be able to produce around 400 giant seaweed potions, Chris said. Liszt alone needed about 10 potions a day, and Charmander needed 60 potions, which added up to 70 potions. Putting aside the medicinal effects of the 400 giant seaweed potions, a rough estimate would be that they could last for 5 to 6 days. Today's harvest of the giant seaweed magic ingredient was less than 100 mu. 600 acres of seaweed potion ready to be harvested would last him and Leo a month. As for the remaining 1,900 mu of giant seaweed magic herbs, they could last for another 3 months after harvesting. In other words, the giant seaweed potion in the giant seaweed forest was enough for him and Charmander to live comfortably for 4 months. He had indeed struck it rich. In these 4 months, the territory would continue to produce other magic herbs, and with the purchase from outside, it was estimated that they could last for another 3 months. In other words, this year there was no need to worry about magic herbs. By next year, the scale of the flame mushroom should be developed. At that time, the flame potion and giant seaweed potion would support the main part, and the black potion, ice flame potion and thorns potion would make up the small part, with the assistance of the black nightshade. His demand for magic herbs had basically been met, and the remaining part would not be difficult to solve if he thought of a way. With the knot in his heart unraveled, his mood instantly relaxed, and the accumulated depression from before dissipated. He held back his proud smile and said gently, "Chris, I am currently in a critical period of training and I need to take a lot of magic herbs. So during this time I may have to trouble you to make more magic herbs. I am really sorry to make you work day and night. You don't have to be so concerned. I am already a great sorcerer, and my technical operations are getting more and more precise. It is very easy to extract the magic juice from the magic herbs, and it is not difficult to make them into magic herbs. It's just that a few of the subtle operations may take a lot of effort. Viscount, I want to bring a group of apprentices." "Bringing apprentices? That's a good thing. You can choose between children from the orphanage and civilian children." Liszt raised his hands and feet in approval. In fact, he had long wanted Chris to bring magic apprentices. The mages of this era were a little mentally ill, but that was because the pursuit of truth distorted their worldview. In the territory of Black Horse Island, Liszt would directly intervene in the growth of the mages and would never let them deviate from the correct worldview. He was more willing to train the mages to become scholars who studied magic, runes and magic arrays. There was no need for them to go to the battlefield. They only needed to learn how to produce magic potions, make magic equipment and conquer various magic arrays. Chris nodded and said, "At the Great Sorcerer stage a lot of research work takes a long time and is meticulous. The power of one person is very limited. I now finally understand why the Great Sorcerer of the Goat Gathering would train ordinary mages like us. I plan to bring 10 magic apprentices first." "Chris, I have a proposal for you to consider." "Sir Viscount, please speak." "I want to build a magic academy. No, it should be called a magic academy, responsible for training production and research mages, not pursuing magic in combat. Some of the students of the magic academy will learn how to make potions, or even only learn one part of the process. Some students will learn another part, and some students will learn how to make magic equipment." He wanted to dismantle the mages into assembly line workers. After all, training a mage required not only resources but also time. He did not have the patience to wait for years or even 10 years for an apprentice to become a mage. A fast-track assembly line worker was the best choice. Chris thought carefully and replied, "If we specialize in the production of potions, this method is indeed feasible, but it is difficult to produce magic equipment. Only mages can understand the concept of magic arrays. Then we will train students who specialize in the production of potions. By the way, potion production can be classified separately as pharmaceutics. Students who can produce potions will be called pharmacists. How about that?" "Pharmacists?" Chris smiled and nodded. "I have no objection. I can also shoulder the work of the Magic Academy, but it takes too much energy to train students. I hope that Sir Viscount can hire a few mages from other places to assist me in managing the Magic Academy." Chapter 539. This chapter is titled, "My Horse Feeds the Sheep." Liszt left the preparations for the Magic Academy to Crazy and Gort, so he did not continue to pay attention to them. Back at his temporary residence in Port Town, he immediately took out the dozen or so giant algae potions that Crazy had made and swallowed them one by one. Then he took out a thick bast paper to record. Only by analyzing the nature of the giant algae potion could he make a better potion. Roar! 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 The little fire dragon Leo was restless in his chest, asking to eat the potion. Liszt had to appease him. "Don't be impatient. Let me analyze the nature of the giant algae potion first. When I'm done you will eat it." Roar! Roar! Leo was still crying for the potion and did not listen to Liszt's explanation. It was not until Liszt took out a few more giant algae potions and gave them to him that he was barely appeased. Only then did he have the opportunity to study the nature of the potion through the remaining 3 giant algae potions. He wrote on a thick bast paper and basically understood the nature of the potion. The potion's effect was chaotic, similar to the black potion, but not as good as the thorn potion. However, it was obviously not as helpful to Liszt and Leo as the flame potion and the ice flame potion, because these 2 potions were fire magic potions and were very suitable for a human and a dragon. "It's a pity that I don't have the black nightshade as a supplement, or I could try the combination of the 2. After swallowing the potion, Liszt operated the dragon's fighting energy for a while, but he had nothing else to do. He did not sleep immediately. Instead, he continued to write and draw on the thick bast paper, thinking about the giant algae forest and how to place the worm stalks to maximize the benefits, as well as the possible existence of the giant algae sprites. However, it was obviously very difficult to develop a farming industry at the bottom of the sea. It's best to let a chi explore the topography of the seabed, and then improve the position of the giant algae forest so that the giant algae can grow near the sea, which will make it easier to manage and harvest. But I haven't even figured out the giant algae forest, so it's too early to talk about transformation. Put away the pen and paper. Then he suddenly thought of something. Writing on thick bast paper and a quill is very inconvenient. Now that I have the ability to protect myself, it is time to invent white paper. If possible, I will try to figure out how to make pencils and pens. I probably won't be able to make ballpoint pens and gel pens. The nib of a gel pen and the ball of a ballpoint pen were not achievable by current technology. The fountain pen, on the other hand, was slightly simpler. However, the fountain pen technology was not small either. The easiest to invent should be the pencil. Unfortunately, the lead of the pencil seemed to be made of graphite. Liszt had no idea where the graphite mine was. He probably had to continue writing with the quill. Another option was to invent a writing brush. Writing brushes were relatively easy to make, and the materials were also convenient. However, although writing Chinese characters with a brush looked good, it was not necessarily more convenient than writing with a goose feather pen. Especially snake script and wind language, which were crooked lines. Writing with a hard pen like a goose feather pen might be more comfortable. In any case, if we can find graphite, we should invent the pencil as soon as possible. First, arrange for someone to try making a writing brush. Let's see whether writing with a writing brush or a quill is more convenient. In that case, it was a good night's dream. The next day, after communicating with a chi, Liszt stopped harvesting the giant seaweed and continued to search the rest of the giant seaweed forest. At the same time, he arranged for fishermen to dive in the offshore area to harvest ordinary giant seaweed to make room for planting the giant seaweed. He searched for worm stalks in the deep water area. The difficulty was high, especially in the deep water area where the water pressure was very high. It was a huge challenge for Liszt to hold his breath. Unfortunately, he could not pass on magic eyes to a chi. He could only continue to dive and surface by himself, using magic eyes to scan every area of the giant seaweed forest. In the morning, he advanced thousands of acres of land, but did not find a single sprite. Somewhat disappointed, he rowed back. Just as he came ashore, he was attracted by a piece of news. He listened to the valet Thomas describe vividly, "Master, many serfs saw lame Billy fall into the sea. When he was about to drown, a colorful sea monster suddenly rushed out, lifted Billy up, and sent him to the shore. I was standing on the shore at that time and saw it clearly. It really was a colorful sea monster." A colorful sea monster? Sent him to the shore? Does Billy not know how to swim? "Master, many of the new fishermen have not learned to swim." "Is that so?" Liszt immediately thought of the colorful dolphin that a chi mentioned, which was the low-level dragon beast that he thought was his reward for the smoke mission. A colorful dolphin can actually save people? This seems to be consistent with the news I heard on Earth that dolphins will save people who fall into the water. Liszt had seen a documentary that said dolphins have great concern and enthusiasm for rescuing objects that do not actively move in the water. Many people claimed that they were rescued by dolphins when they fell into the water and were pushed out of the water. Some people had done experiments and found that whether it was dead turtles, old air mattresses, lifebuoys, or thick planks, dolphins would do the same thing. Marine mammal experts believed that this originated from dolphins' nature to care for their children. As mammals, they had no gills and needed to surface to breathe. But the baby dolphin often could not return to the surface in time, so the dolphin mother would help it up and send it to the surface. Now, this colorful dolphin did the same thing and saved a serf who fell into the water. This gave Liszt a good impression of it, and he quickly formulated a plan to capture it, let people pretend to fall into the water, lure it to rescue, and then cast a net to capture it. "However, if I capture it now, doesn't that mean I have to change the mission?" He called out the smoke mission. The mission content had not changed, which proved that more secrets of the giant kelp forest had not been discovered. I am still not sure what the secret of the giant kelp forest is. If I interfere with the mission and instead neglect the real secret, wouldn't the gains outweigh the losses? The giant kelp chain mission. It was likely to involve the giant kelp sprite, so Liszt did not dare to be careless. The value of the giant kelp sprite, Liszt was not willing to exchange it for 100 low-level dragon beasts. After all, the dragon beasts were only slightly more advanced than the World of Warcraft, but the giant kelp sprite could grow at least 6,000 mu of giant kelp, and its value was immeasurable. The reason why the tulip family was so strong, able to support a large family and train a large number of Earth Knights, was because of the tulip sprite's continuous growth of magic potions. Without the sprite, it was difficult to even support a sky knight, let alone maintain the large-scale consumption of orders of chivalry in the castle. I will let it be free for a few days. When I find the giant kelp sprite, I will subdue this colorful dolphin. It seems very cool to have a dragon-type sea monster as a mount. So it was. In the blink of an eye, the day passed. At dusk, List had already left. Achi still worked overtime as usual, preparing to return to Mangrove Island when it was completely dark. Shuttling through the increasingly thick giant kelp, she constantly explored new areas. Some fierce sharks even dared to attack her, but when she controlled the water to beat them, the sharks hurriedly ran away. As for killing them, it was even simpler. List had told her a method. She just had to turn the shark over with its belly up and the shark would soon faint. Achi had tested it and it was indeed so. When the shark was belly up, it directly fainted and its life was at her mercy. After scaring away the shark, she saw a huge starfish, wondering if it was a sea monster, but when she approached it, she did not feel the breath of magic, and it was still just an ordinary starfish. Just as she was constantly searching. Suddenly, a giant kelp in front of her attracted her attention. She could not help but open her mouth, so surprised that she wanted to shout. It could no longer be called a giant kelp, it should be called a giant pillar in the water. The thick roots of the giant kelp grasped the seabed rocks hundreds of meters deep, almost like a wall at least 2 or 3 meters in diameter, and the leaves on it were also very huge, curving and hovering in the sea. The leaves on it were also very large. They curled and spiraled in the sea, looking like a huge sea snake. Worm grass. Chapter 540. He got up early in the morning and opened the window. The sun was beautiful. It was another sunny day. As April continued to turn, the weather on Black Horse Island was getting better day by day. After the end of the spring plowing, the surf army had returned to construction. Several small towns' wooden houses rose from the ground, roads were connected, and craftsman workshops were put into operation one by one. The transfer of worm stalks was also gradually completed. Now, except for the apple tree worm stalks, tomato worm stalks, and Venus flytrap worm stalks, which were still planted in Flower Town, all the other worm stalks were moved to Black Horse Island. Plantations were divided in each town to settle these worm stalks. Even the castle servants were sent to the port town to serve List. By the way, they were also adapting to life in the port town and contributing to the establishment of the new castle in the future. There were more than 30 servants in the castle, but there were still 30 or 40 children practicing. There was no law prohibiting the use of child labor in this world. Children practicing in the castle, whether it is the quality of life or future employment, are fully guaranteed. Many civilian parents want to send their children to the castle for internship. He simply washed up and did not take a bath. Anyway, he was going to go into the water later, so there was no need to take another bath. After breakfast, it was not yet 7:30, and the fishermen who harvested the giant algae on the beach were already working hard. List came to the beach, jumped on a sampan, and was ready to paddle in the direction of the giant algae forest. At the same time, he habitually called out the smoke mission and took a look. Just a single glance was enough to stun him. Mission completed, reward, a colorful dolphin. This reward was no surprise. As early as 2 days ago, he had guessed that the colorful dolphin that Achi was chasing would be his reward, a low-level dragon sea monster. What was unexpected was the new smoke mission. Quest. Achi has discovered the core secret of the kelp forest at the bottom of the sea. It is a giant kelp worm stalk that belongs to a ferocious kelp sprite. Achi can't even get close to it. Perhaps you need a new helper. Why not obtain a water mount first? Reward, a giant algae spirit. Giant algae spirit. It really is the giant algae spirit. Achi has found its worm stalk and obviously had contact with it. During this period of time, List had been thinking about this giant kelp sprite day and night. Now that he had finally received confirmation of its existence, one could well imagine his mood. Great sprites were the status symbols of earls and lords. Only families with great sprites would dare to call themselves great nobles. Now, he passed the giant seaweed chain mission. He was finally going to obtain a greater elf and join the ranks of greater nobles. If he released Leo, he might be able to instantly join the ranks of dragon knights and attack the king. Of course, he might also be pressed to the ground by the Sapphire Grand Duke and ruthlessly whipped away Leo. In a situation where the little fire dragon could not be exposed, a big elf would be the best symbol of his identity. Inhale. He exhaled. After taking a few deep breaths, he regained his composure. The appearance of the giant seaweed sprite means that we can plant more than 6,000 acres of seaweed magic ingredients. But the most important thing now is how to contract it. I've only heard of wild great sprites in Night Tales, and they usually contract humans on their own. Night Tales were beautiful fantasies. Not only did the great sprites beg the protagonist to contract them, even the dragons begged the protagonist to ride them. There were also a lot of noble ladies who threw themselves at the protagonist. But in reality, elves that took the initiative to contract humans were very rare. Active elves like the mangrove sprite Nami could only be counted as an exception. The giant seaweed sprites were obviously not an exception. They were not close to humans and they were not even close to their companions. Before Fitz and Tam contracted them, they bared their teeth at List and Achi. Without the fragrant jade powder, there was no way to contract them. After the contract, they often quarreled. If it were not for List's mandatory ban, they might have already won. And this giant seaweed sprite, in the description of the smoke mission, was named Brutal, which showed its character. Lesser sprites have mastered planting magic, but the great sprite's planting magic is stronger, and it already has great strength. Even Achi can't get close to it. I think it must be very difficult to contract it underwater. You must bring enough jade powder and be mentally prepared for a stalemate. The most important thing is to capture the colorful dolphin. The colorful dolphin was the key hint of the smoke mission. List had yet to fully understand the principles or rules of the smoke mission. He also did not know how powerful the smoke dragon's power of fate was, or how it could rely on the threads of fate to create communication. But following the smoke mission was obviously the fastest way. While thinking, he had already rowed the sampan past the fishermen offshore and rowed further away. Achi had long been paying attention to List underwater, so she quickly came to the surface to meet him. The shell opened and Fitz and Tam, together with the 4 sprite worms, immediately swam towards him and circled around him. "Brother, you finally came." Achi found the giant seaweed sprite. As soon as they met, Achi told him about her encounter as if she was presenting a treasure. When she was working overtime, she accidentally found a huge giant seaweed worm stalk. After careful observation, she successfully found the great sprite. It was a baby-sized sprite, the same tawny color as the lesser sprites, and its whole body was bright like a huge gem. It spread its transparent fins, circled around its worm stalk, and happily swam tirelessly. Occasionally, when a fish approached it, it would wave its hand and sprinkle a ray of light. In an instant, giant seaweed would break out of the fish's body and turn them into a pile of minced meat. It is very fierce. After discovering Achi, it chased Achi for a long time. Achi doesn't want to hurt it, but she is also afraid that it will plant giant seaweed on her body. Achi said in a low voice. In terms of fighting strength, she was definitely superior to the giant seaweed sprite, but she could only be chased and beaten without being able to fight. Is the giant seaweed sprite so fierce? Have you tried to lure it with jade powder? Achi tried, but it would drive Achi away before eating the jade powder. Once Achi turned around and approached it, it would stop eating the jade powder and drive Achi away. "Brother, this giant seaweed sprite is really fierce and its big mouth looks very scary." The giant seaweed sprite and the lesser sprite were very beautiful, but their mouths and their teeth were a bit frightening. Since the giant seaweed sprite is not easy to contract, then we should first come up with a good way to deal with it in one fell swoop. List said, "But before that, I plan to catch the colorful dolphin. I saw that it can save people and maybe it can understand human nature." "Ah, that sea monster can save people?" Achi was very surprised. List briefly explained the matter of the surfs falling into the water and then said, "I'll arrange for the surfs to fall into the water, lure out the colorful dolphin, and then try to communicate with it. You hide on the side. If it goes well, then everything will be fine. If it doesn't go well, then we'll catch it first." "Okay." After the plan was made, Achi dived and followed List back to the coastal area. He found serfs who could swim and had them pretend to fall into the water to attract the colorful dolphin. He didn't know where the colorful dolphin was hiding, nor how far it had run. The act of pretending to fall into the water lasted from morning to afternoon, but the colorful dolphin didn't appear. Just when List thought it was impossible, the serfs who were shouting for help in the water were suddenly pushed out of the water by something. Immediately, not far away, List saw through his binoculars that there was indeed a colorful dolphin under the surfs. The dolphin was very large, much larger than the dolphins he had seen in the aquarium on Earth. It might be the size of a killer whale. It had a streamlined body like a dolphin, and the color of its skin reflected the sunlight with a colorful luster. To be precise, it actually looks more like a white whale. List exclaimed in admiration. He quietly rode the sampan and advanced toward the colorful dolphin. In his sampan, there were dozens of extremely delicious small fish. Food was the most important thing for people, and it was obvious that animals also used food as their main motivation to survive. Using food as a lure was the least technical, but at the same time the most effective method. Just as he approached the colorful dolphin, which had pushed the serfs into the water to the shore, suddenly turned around and pushed the serfs toward List. Seeing this. Chapter 541. It was a rainbow dolphin, or more appropriately a rainbow whale. It carried the drowning serfs towards List's sampan. Its purpose was obvious. It wanted to send the serfs to the sampan. List didn't move, but his body was tense. If the rainbow whale dared to attack him, he wouldn't hesitate to leap into the air and let a chi catch it. However, the rainbow whale approached the sampan bit by bit, but it still didn't have any intention to attack. It was just trying to save the serfs. When it reached the side of the sampan, it arched its head and directly bounced the serfs onto the sampan. List's sampan was relatively large, and he used chi to control the sampan so that it wouldn't be smashed by the serfs. The serfs safely boarded the boat. The rainbow whale's head floated on the water's surface and cried cheerfully, "Chirp, chirp." It was a bit like a magpie's cry. The tone was mellow and varied, just like the rich variety of human language. List could feel its cheerful mood. List also relaxed. This 8 to 9 meter long fellow seemed to be very close to humans. He quickly picked up the small fish at the bow and threw it to the rainbow whale. This small fish was a specialty of Pearl Lake called silverfish. It tasted delicious and had become List's daily necessity. As soon as the rainbow whale saw the small fish, it immediately opened its mouth and swallowed it. It didn't know if it tasted the fish, but it seemed to enjoy it and didn't leave the sampan. It kept its head floating on the water's surface and continued to look at List with its small eyes. List wasn't stingy and threw another silverfish. Chirp, chirp. The rainbow whale was very excited. It had already stretched its head to the side of the sampan and opened its mouth to eat. It didn't know if it was enjoying the delicious silverfish or the free food. The shape of its head was indeed very similar to that of a beluga whale. It had a large and round forehead and a slightly large mouth, but it didn't have many teeth. Its eyes were on both sides of its head and were a bit small compared to its body. The rainbow skin didn't seem to be the original color of the skin, but rather a layer of oil on the skin that reflected sunlight. Looking at it from different angles, the colors of the rainbow were constantly changing. It was a very strange oil. List, who had cast magic eyes, fed the rainbow whale another silver-striped fish, and then carefully examined its body. His body was filled with bluish-white magic power. This was the magic power of the water attribute. Basically, all the sea monsters in the sea should be of the water attribute. After all, they soaked in the sea all day long. That layer of grease was also filled with the color of mana, and it was very active mana that was constantly circulating. I feel like this layer of grease is some kind of magic. List wasn't sure, but that didn't stop him from communicating with the rainbow whale, communicating through food. It was said that dolphin-type animals had very high intelligence, second only to chimpanzees in terms of intelligence. There were even some theories that the killer whales of the dolphin family were smarter than chimpanzees. After all, humans were the overlords of the land while killer whales were the overlords of the sea. Both of them were overlords, so their IQ was naturally not low. Killer whales, like dolphins, are very friendly to humans. Wild killer whales have never killed anyone. After a few silver-striped fish, List felt that the time was right. He could not help but reach out and touch the rainbow whale's head. The rainbow whale didn't show any signs of resistance and allowed him to stroke its big head. So after a while, List felt that he had established a friendship with the rainbow whale. The smoke mission told me that the rainbow whale is a suitable mount in the water. Should I ride it for a spin? It doesn't seem very friendly to ride it directly. Why don't I dive into the water and ride it? He did what he thought. He first blew the horn to remind Ichi to protect him. Then he jumped into the sea with the silver-striped fish in one hand. Chirp. The rainbow whale immediately swam around List and touched him with its body from time to time, but it had no intention of attacking. Its small eyes stared at the silver-striped fish in his hand, but it didn't rush up to grab it. Seeing this, List already knew that he was halfway to success. He stuffed the silver-striped fish into the rainbow whale's mouth, then took out another silver-striped fish from the sampan and fed it to it. At the same time, he stuffed his waist bag full of silver-striped fish. Then he slowly hugged the rainbow whale, flipped over and rode on the rainbow whale's back. He grabbed its dorsal fin. His body was ready to be overturned. Unexpectedly, the rainbow whale didn't overturn him. It just remained still and made a strange sound, chirp, chirp. Its meaning was unclear. But List quickly took out a silver-striped fish and threw it in front of the rainbow whale. The rainbow whale jumped, bit the silver-striped fish and ate it. It slowly swam on the sea but still didn't shake off List. Sir Lord is so great. The serf who fell into the water was sitting on the sampan. He was so surprised that he couldn't close his mouth when he saw this scene. In just a short moment, the great Sir Lord rode on the sea monster. As expected of the great Sky Knight, even the sea monster was easily subdued. Then, he saw the Sir Lord riding the rainbow whale gradually go further and further away. Accompanied by the rainbow whale's chirp, and the Sir Lord's laughter, he finally disappeared from sight. So great! Riding the rainbow whale, List continuously made waves on the water surface. Although the waves splashed and drenched List, he still laughed happily. Riding a dog, a bird or even a dragon was nothing. Only riding a fish was the coolest. The rainbow whale had already finished eating the silver-striped fish in his pocket, but the friendship built by the silver-striped fish was already indestructible. The rainbow whale carried List and swam around. At this moment it let out a high-pitched cry, chirp, then it dove into the water. Before List could hold his breath, he also sank into the sea with the rainbow whale. He suddenly turned pale with fright and felt like he was going to choke. However, he didn't choke. Instead, his body was surrounded by an ice-cold texture, and he could breathe freely in the water. Breathing was not as comfortable as breathing on the water surface, but it didn't prevent him from obtaining oxygen. After recovering from his panic, he suddenly discovered that his body was glowing with a rainbow luster. This is the rainbow whale's magic? List froze for a moment, then immediately cast magic eyes and saw that, like the rainbow whale, there was a layer of active magic constantly circulating on his body. A moment later. Understanding this, List laughed heartily in the water. He simply loved this rainbow whale. It was a natural underwater mount that could actually help the knight breathe underwater. That layer of colorful grease was clearly a kind of magic, an unheard of magic. No wonder the smoke mission prompt and the rainbow whale were helpful for him to contract the giant kelp sprite. The rainbow whale's magic simply gave him the ability to move underwater. He no longer had to hold his breath until his face turned red, and he also had to frequently come to the surface to breathe. Very good. He couldn't help but pat the rainbow whale's back and shout, "Good job, rainbow whale. From now on, you will be my best mount in the water." With the protective layer of magic, he could already speak freely underwater, and there were no problems with his hearing and vision. Chirp. Chapter 542. When a chi appeared, the rainbow whale had an extreme reaction. It turned around and tried to escape. However, after List comforted it for half an hour, it accepted a chi's existence and was no longer afraid of the siren that had captured it before. Thanks to List, a chi caught some small fish and threw them to the rainbow whale, which successfully dispelled its hostility towards a chi. Food was always the best tool to communicate with animals. However, what touched List the most was that the rainbow whale didn't throw List off when it was avoiding a chi, nor did it remove the protective spell on him. Bringing List with it to avoid a chi greatly slowed down its speed. Otherwise, it could easily get rid of a chi. A chi was an ocean elf. She was much faster than regular fish, but compared to the rainbow whale, she was still far behind. List suspected that the rainbow whale could reach a speed of 120 kilometers per hour. Even when carrying a person, it could reach 80 kilometers per hour. That was because a chi's highest speed was 80 kilometers per hour. Since you're a female rainbow whale, I'll call you Rose. As for why he thought of the name Rose, it was because when List rode the whale, the image of Jack hugging Rose from Titanic floated in his mind. It was just as cool. List called Rose's protective layer of magic the rainbow breathing membrane. Its main function was to breathe underwater. It seemed to use magic to collect oxygen from the seawater and provide it for breathing through the nose. It was a very special spell. List had never seen it in any magic books. It seemed to be a spell unique to the rainbow whale. A chi, we can talk underwater now. List ate some food on the surface of the water to fill his stomach. Then he rode the rainbow whale to patrol the kelp forest. The rainbow whale really understood humans. List only needed to play with its dorsal fin. If he tilted it to the left, it would swim to the left. If he tilted it to the right, lifted it up, or pressed it down, it would swim accordingly. It seemed to like this way of interaction. It was probably because it was too lonely. Just like the mangrove elf Nami, Loneliness made her take the initiative to get close to others. List hadn't met many draconic beasts, but both Loki the Chocobo and Lolth the rainbow whale lived alone. He had never heard of this kind of dragon beast before. It was obvious that they were extremely rare. Even humans had not discovered them. Dolphins were social animals, but rainbow whales moved alone. It was obvious that they were lonely. "Brother, Rose is so nice." Achi reached out and touched Rose's belly. Rose immediately let out a cheerful cry. Her cries in the sea were slightly different from her cries on land. It was deeper, but the same sense of cheerfulness could be felt. Hee 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 hee, let's go and meet that giant kelp sprite. The earlier we can form a contract with it, the more I feel at ease. With the seven-colored whale as his mount and the basic telepathy between them, List was confident enough to form a contract with this ferocious wild kelp sprite. Of course, he still had to be careful, because he couldn't release his combat energy on the back of the seven-colored whale. Once the combat energy gushed out, it would quickly break through the seven-colored breathing membrane, which would bring trouble to both List and the seven-colored whale. Probably because the seven-colored breathing membrane had been used for too long, the seven-colored whale was no longer used to holding its breath underwater. To deal with the giant kelp sprite, he would have to deal with it. With Achi leading the way, they quickly advanced deeper into the kelp forest. After a while, they arrived at the location of the giant kelp worm stalk. "Brother, it's here. I see it." List motioned for Rose to stop and quietly observed the giant worm stalk in front of them. The roots of the giant kelp grasped the rocks in the deep pit. Just as Achi described, it was at least 2 to 3 meters thick and looked like a huge pillar. The worm stalk was 40 meters long and straight up. After 40 meters, it began to curl and grow along the shallow seawater. Almost a single worm stalk could form a forest. This suddenly reminded List of the legend of the Elven King. According to the legend, the Elven King was the end of the evolution of the dragon elves. The worm stalk was incomparably huge. A single worm stalk could form an entire forest. Even countless World of Warcraft, elves and dragons lived in the forest formed by the Elven King's worm stalk. The giant kelp sprite's worm stalk was much smaller than the legend of the Elven King. However, its huge body and densely packed leaves could indeed be called a worm stalk that could form a large forest. The area it expanded was at least as big as a football field. Previously, the giant kelp sprite's worm stalk was only as thick as a bucket, which was already extremely huge. Who would have thought that the giant kelp sprite's worm stalk would be so ridiculously huge? "Brother, the big sprite is over there." Achi quickly found the giant kelp sprite and pointed it out to List. List looked in the direction of her finger and saw an infant-sized sprite holding a leaf of his worm stalk, swinging in the water. Using magic eyes, he could see the extremely dense magic light within its body. The jade powder was well prepared. He could boldly seduce the big sprite. List and Achi whispered to each other for a moment and decided to use the jade powder as the main temptation plan, which would last for half an hour. If they still couldn't deal with it in half an hour, then they would attack from both sides and capture the giant kelp sprite. List had chi and wasn't afraid of the giant kelp sprite's magic at all. Moreover, his snakeskin armor was very resistant to magic. Not only did he put on it, but he also put one on Achi. It was the first time for Achi to put on clothes, but to List's great regret, the opaque water belt around her body was still there. The leather armor was obviously a bit too big and did not fit her body. Moreover, wearing only one piece of leather armor looked very strange. In the strangeness, there was a trace of strange temptation. If it were any other time, List might have expressed his respect. But at this time he was more focused on the giant kelp sprite. After making preparations, he directly rode the rainbow whale to the giant kelp sprite. This successfully attracted the big kelp sprite's attention. Its hair stood on end, and the small palm-sized kelp on its head instantly stood upright. It immediately swam towards List and threw out a few rays of light, planting the giant kelp. The rays were very fast and couldn't be avoided, falling on the man and the whale. The seeds made of magic quickly burrowed into their bodies. However, the rainbow whale had magic to resist, while List had leather armor and chi. The seeds could only grow on the surface. Before they could grow to the length of a finger, List reached out and wiped them away. Just as I described, violent and fierce. List sprinkled a handful of jade powder and didn't fight back. He directly rode the rainbow whale away. The giant kelp sprite chased after him for a while. Seeing that it couldn't catch up, it swam back and began to search for the jade powder that had fallen on the rocks. List had half an hour to reach a stalemate with it. But no matter how much jade powder he sprinkled or how friendly he acted, he couldn't get a trace of gentleness from the giant kelp sprite. The only responses were gulp, onger, blatta, and other unclear cries. Among them, a deep roar was the dominant sound. Big elves could speak, but this giant kelp sprite had no one to teach it, so it could only roar and shout meaninglessly. As time passed, List's patience was exhausted. List's face was calm. He slightly narrowed his eyes and finally made up his mind to change his plan. He shouted to Achi, who was hiding in the distance, "Gentle means are useless. Achi, let's do it." Boom. Achi immediately turned into a white lightning bolt and rushed towards the giant kelp sprite. At the same time, she released a magic water vortex to disrupt the giant kelp sprite's movements. On the other side, the rainbow whale, under List's control, also rushed towards the giant kelp sprite excitedly. List did not use any fighting skills, nor did he take out any weapons. He just took out a fine-eyed fishing net from the gem space that he had long prepared, and covered the head of the giant algae sprite. A water archmage and a sky knight tried their best to capture the giant kelp sprite, whose alertness was almost exhausted. Obviously, it wasn't difficult at all. The big kelp reacted fiercely and tore at the fishing net. Its teeth were very sharp and it tore the fishing net in a few bites. Just as it struggled to break out of the fishing net, List rushed over and grabbed the big kelp. Then, at lightning speed, he put his fingertip into its mouth and took a bite. He felt a sharp pain on his fingertip, and his finger was already bleeding profusely. If he hadn't been mentally prepared and pulled his finger out in time, it might have been bitten off by the giant kelp sprite's sharp teeth. However, this pain was soon replaced by a wonderful feeling of telepathy. It was as if his consciousness had been divided into two. One part was playing the role of List, who was suffering, and the other part was playing the role of the giant kelp sprite, who was experiencing a novel experience. Gulp. The giant kelp sprite was also stunned, its eyes filled with confusion. For a moment, it didn't know who it was and what it wanted to do. Chapter 543. This chapter is Dream of Ancient Jiangnan. The sprite contract could be regarded as a kind of strange contact magic. The main point of contact was the mouth of the sprite. As long as it bit any part of the human body, it could establish an unbreakable contract. There was no need to break the skin, just forceful contact. List did not know the principle behind it. Countless wizards, knight, and other researchers of the sprite contract also did not know the reason. Many wizards had expressed their views on the sprite contract in magic books, but there were not many with real evidence or opinions. However, Crazy Truth had previously provided him with a conjecture, which made him come up with his own inference. At that time, List had given her the sprite worm Amber to study, providing her with ideas for breaking through to Great Wizard, and she had indeed made some discoveries. She believed that the sprite worm itself was a complex magic array, most likely composed of magic power in the form of a more advanced magic array. The forms of magic arrays range from basic magic arrays to ordinary magic arrays, and then to dynamic magic arrays, each more complex than the previous one. There had to be a higher level magic array above that, but Chris had no clue as to how to get to the magic shooter level. She could only guess that at the end of the magic array lay sprites or even dragons. In fact, List quite believed in this inference. The triangular theory of magic power, matter, and spirit could be very compatible with the structural theory of magic arrays. In particular, the whole process of him giving birth to the little fire dragon Leo was the best proof of the triangular theory. The sprite might be a touch-based magic array. A slight touch would activate the magic array, and a contract would be established. He looked at the confused giant seaweed sprite. List suppressed his excitement of having his first sprite and whispered to Achi, "I have some inspiration for magic arrays. Achi, later I will write a book called Triangle Theory and Magic Array Structure Unification Demonstration. You can help me refer to it." "Ah, big brother, what new discoveries have you made?" Achi could not keep up with List's train of thought. One moment he was contracting a sprite, and the next moment he was thinking of writing a magic book. "Forming a contract with this great sprite gave me inspiration. Achi will help you refer to it carefully." While they were talking, the seven-colored whale could not help but touch the confused giant algae sprite. It was very interested in sprites, but it had no intention of touching them. After being touched by it, the giant seaweed sprite shuddered and sobered up. Go. Longer. Roaring, he started to cast spells on the rainbow whale. With a flash of light, countless giant algae grew out of the rainbow whale's body. The rainbow whale was so frightened that it twisted its body and wanted to scrape the giant algae off the rocks. After coming to his senses, List reached out and wiped the seaweed off its body. Then he communicated with the kelp sprite and used his emotions to control it. Stop, kelp sprite. Don't cast spells. Gulp. The giant kelp sprite turned its head and bared its teeth at List. How dare you bare your teeth at me? Gulp. We've already made a contract. I'm your master, do you understand? List wasn't angry. Instead, he felt that it was very strange. He was clearly connected to the giant seaweed sprite, and they could perceive each other's emotions very clearly. But the giant seaweed sprite was still not friendly to him. He could feel that the other's mind was in a mess. On one hand, the power of the contract made it unable to resist the pressure of their wills. On the other hand, it was indeed hostile towards List, an instinctive hostility towards an intruder. Looking at the snarling giant seaweed, he already understood that it lacked training. Like the great tulip sprite Fragrance, a domestic sprite, it was naturally close to humans. However, the giant seaweed sprite was a wild sprite. It had lived in the wild for who knew how long, and its wild nature had already taken over most of its instincts. Even the mental connection brought by the contract couldn't immediately eliminate its wild nature. Fortunately. At the very least, the contract could influence the giant seaweed sprite to stop attacking List or running away. As for how to tame it, it would depend on how patient List was. And so, decisively, he took out some jade powder and placed it on his palm, calling out to the giant seaweed sprite. Stop shouting. Come and eat the jade powder. Remember, if you follow me, you'll never lack jade powder. This time is a greeting gift. The next time you roar at me, you won't be able to eat jade powder. You'll only get jade powder if you stop roaring. With the mental connection, it was very easy to communicate with the giant seaweed sprite. After understanding, it struggled and squirmed and finally gradually approached List. Standing on the rainbow whale's back, it lowered its head and began to eat the jade powder in List's hand. List stretched out his other hand and stroked the small seaweed on its head. It immediately raised its head and bared its teeth again. But List immediately communicated with it with an emotional message of, if you dare to roar, I won't give you jade powder, which made it retract its mouth unnaturally. After struggling for a few seconds, it simply gave up on its dignity and focused on eating the jade powder, no longer caring about how List stroked it. After a few times, it even enjoyed List's stroking. With the binding of the contract, it's very easy to train it. List was in a good mood. Today was truly a great harvest. He had obtained a low-level dragon beast, the rainbow whale, that allowed him to breathe underwater, and successfully contracted a giant seaweed sprite. He felt as if he had reached the peak of his life. In his complacency, he couldn't help but say to Ichi with a bright smile, from now on, the land is mine, the sky is mine, and the sea is mine too. Hee big brother, with this big seaweed sprite, you'll definitely become an earl or even a marquis. I'll also become a dragon knight, establish a new country and ascend to the throne. Ichi didn't doubt it at all. Yes, big brother will become a king. The rainbow whale Lolth also chimed in. Hiyo Hololuyulu, hearing the rainbow whale's cry, the giant seaweed sprite didn't even raise its head from eating the jade powder. With a wave of its hand, a ray of light grew on the rainbow whale. If it couldn't teach List a lesson, why couldn't it teach a fish a lesson? Mission complete. Reward, 1 giant seaweed sprite. The smoke mission had been completed as soon as he rode on the rainbow whale Lolth. Naturally, a new mission was also issued. Mission, the core secret of the giant seaweed forest has been found. The water mount has also been obtained. It is time to complete the final exploration of the giant seaweed forest, settle down the giant seaweed worm stalks, and replan the giant seaweed forest. Reward, a shell that produces pearls. After successfully contracting the giant seaweed sprite, List was ready to strike while the iron was hot. He wanted to finish the exploration of the giant seaweed forest as soon as possible and find the remaining sprites. He suspected that there were still sprites in this huge giant seaweed forest. After all, only half of the forest had been explored. Currently, every giant seaweed sprite was a strategic resource. Before preparing for the exploration, he didn't plan to bring the giant seaweed sprite along. First, he hadn't trained it well. The giant seaweed sprite still had a strong sense of resistance. Second, it wasn't convenient to bring it along. Unlike the lesser sprites and sprite worms, it wouldn't be directly and forcefully restrained by List. It would be bad if it saw the other sprites inside a cheese shell and started fighting. Only after List had thoroughly trained it could he meet the other sprites and bring them back to protect them. Ichi. I'm going to give the giant seaweed sprite a name. The great seaweed sprite can already talk normally like humans, so it needs a name. List touched the small seaweed on the giant seaweed sprite's head and said, I have 3 names here. Help me take a look. Okay, go ahead, big brother. Chapter 544. Achi thought the name Loy sounded good, but in the end, List still rejected it. For the sake of tradition, I'll call you Parker. The so-called tradition was the name of the mounts, World of Warcraft, elves, and dragons he had tamed along the way. All of them had the same style: Fire Dragon, Black Dragon, Dosen, Blessed Curls, Lightning, Ella, Nami, Loki, Mickey, Leo, Fitz, Tam, and Lolth. Therefore, the giant kelp sprite was called Parker according to tradition. Ghost Shadow Parker of Bloodport, a very fierce hero in League of Legends, matched the temperament of the giant kelp sprite quite well. You'll be called Parker, remember? Gulp. You're called Parker, say it after me. List used his mind to communicate, pointed at it, and then said the serpentines. Parker. Parker turned his head to the side, ignoring List. List smiled and took out a handful of jade powder. Parker. Gulp. Parker stared at the jade powder, unable to move his eyes away. After a while he reluctantly said, "Bye. Parker, it's Parker Parker." List clenched his fist, still smiling. Parker. Parker, Parker. For the third time, the giant kelp sprite finally clearly shouted his name, Parker. Good boy, come, this is yours. I have something to do now, I'll leave for a while, I'll come find you in the evening. He handed the jade powder to Parker. List waved his hand, riding the seven-colored whale Lolth, and together with Achi, they left Parker and its huge worm stalk. When their figures disappeared in the giant kelp forest, Parker, who had been eating the jade powder with his head down, suddenly stopped. Instead, he raised his head and looked in the direction List had left. He was in a daze and no one knew what he was thinking. A quarter of an hour, maybe half an hour. Parker opened his mouth and softly shouted, Parker. He continued to shout, Parker. 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 The shouting became louder and louder, and in the end he simply laughed and shouted, Parker. Parker. He was excited to have a name. It had never thought of giving itself a name while living in the sea. Mimicking List's style, he pointed at himself and said, Parker. Its voice was sharp, but the tone was pleasant to hear. It was just that the teeth in its mouth ruined the aesthetic. After shouting Parker, for a long time he even forgot to eat the jade powder in his hand. At this moment, a fish rushed over, seemingly wanting to taste the jade powder. But before it could eat, a ray of light flashed and countless giant seaweeds pierced out from the fish's body, tearing it apart. Parker turned his head. Looking at the remains of the dead fish, he roared, Parker. When the other fish saw the tragic end of the fish and Parker's roar, they immediately turned around and ran away in fear. For a time, Parker was the only one left near the worm stalk. As it ate the jade powder, it returned to its worm stalk, rolled up a leaf and wrapped itself in it. A faint murmur could be heard, Parker. Very soon. This place became the territory of all kinds of fish, prawns and crabs. I can actually feel Parker's mood, like a happy child getting a toy. Shortly after List left, he sensed Parker's mood. He did not know why Parker was so happy. He did not see it like this when he gave it the jade powder. List shook his head and did not care too much. As long as it was not panicking when encountering danger, there was no need to care. With the rainbow whale Lolth, his search speed at the bottom of the sea increased by leaps and bounds. It seemed that there were still 10 to 20,000 mu of giant seaweed forest to search, but it was basically just a round trip. Magic eyes continued to operate. Despite the narrow field of vision underwater, the water was clear, and he could still see dozens of meters away. With a glance, he could clearly distinguish whether there was a magic retroaction or not, thus saving him the tedious identification process. In other words, Magic Eyes, this chi secret skill, existed to find sprites. Suddenly, his eyes lit up. A bit of magic retroaction light attracted him. He immediately urged Lolth to rush toward the light. Sure enough, it was a giant seaweed worm stalk with a sprite worm wandering at its roots. Without much to say, he sprinkled the jade powder, stretched out his finger and took a bite. The giant seaweed forest had contributed the fifth sprite worm. The appearance of this sprite worm proved that List's conjecture was correct. There were still sprites in the giant seaweed forest. Thereupon, he continued to energize himself and diligently explore every nook and cranny. In the evening, when he was about to return, he made a new discovery. This time, the worm stalk he found turned out to be the giant seaweed lesser sprite's worm stalk. The third giant seaweed lesser sprite. The blessings came too frequently, continuously smashing my face. I need to go back and have a good rest. List used the old method and successfully contracted the lesser sprite. After thinking for a long time, he named it Eddie. Apart from continuing the tradition, he could not think of a suitable name for his mount, World of Warcraft, sprite, and dragon. Therefore, Eddie became a meaningless name. This was also probably related to the poor timing of its appearance. Who let Parker appear before it? With a greater sprite, List inevitably neglected the lesser sprite. Eddie was the icing on the cake after being smashed by the blessings. At this time he was already numb to it. He was too lazy to think of a nice name. Many greater aristocrats raised sprites without names, only using worm stalks as a code name. Now that he was gradually stepping into the ranks of greater aristocrats, there would be more and more lesser sprites in the future. He stuffed Eddie into a cheese shell and forbade it from fighting with Fitz and Tam before the three giant seaweed lesser sprites bared their teeth at each other. The wild nature of the sprites was suppressed. List called out to Achi and prepared to return. Riding on Loltha's back, he was a little absent-minded. As I continue to improve my strength, the number of sprites, mounts, and World of Warcraft will increase, and the companions I once cherished will gradually become marginal. In fact, I haven't cared about Fire Dragon, Black Dragon, and Lightning for a long time. Loki has replaced them. There was a touch of sadness. But this was life. Just like childhood toys, they would always quietly leave at some point. At least they can still enjoy the life they deserve in my territory and get the careful care of my servants. List put away his sadness. He was not a sentimental person. He was striving for his ideals. Soon they returned to the position of the giant seaweed sprite worm stalk and woke up the sleeping Parker. List stayed for a while, practiced saying Parker a few times and told Parker his name. List. He pointed to himself and then to the giant seaweed sprite. Parker. This time, Parker behaved harmoniously. It first pointed to itself. Parker. Then it pointed to List and said clearly, List. List suddenly smiled and pointed to the siren next to him. Achi. Parker's face suddenly changed and he looked like he was about to roar. Gulp. Achi was a little disappointed. But List quickly comforted her. Don't worry, Parker will slowly become familiar with you. Chapter 545. After teaching Parker for a while, the sun quickly sank to the sea level. List also had to return to Port Town and go back to land to rest, but he was worried about the seven-colored whale Lolth. Although they got along well today, it would be awkward if Lolth wandered around and couldn't be found the next day. So, he intended to entrust Lolth to Achi just like he entrusted all the sea elves to Achi. Lolth, follow Achi and don't run around. You will live in the Black Horse Island waters. I will treat you well in the future and Achi will take good care of you. Chirp. The seven-colored whale didn't know if it understood, but it was very cheerful. Originally, it was very hostile to Achi who was bent on hunting it, but now it had completely forgotten that it could accept Achi's hug and touch. When they arrived at the beach, List stood in the shallow water and waved to the seven-colored whale. The seven-colored whale did not dare to swim to the shore, but it swam in the shallow water, unwilling to leave and reluctant to part with List. It was not until List left the shore with the waiting servants that it reluctantly returned to the sea under the urging of Achi. Led by Achi, it swam to Mangrove Island. On the other side. When List returned, he was immediately greeted by Gort. This territory consultant has been in high spirits recently. His wife and children have moved from Coral City to Flower Town, and then he quietly moved his mistress, Freya, and illegitimate son, Donald, to Port Town. When they went to Flower Town, they were an old couple with 2 adult children. When they returned to Port Town, they were a young lover and a 2-year-old illegitimate son. The joy of family was endless. Sir, I heard that you subdued a sea monster at sea? It seems that you already know. Yes, it is a 7-colored whale and it has become my mount. I can ride it and swim in the sea. This vast sea is my back garden. List raised his eyebrows, looking very proud. It was indeed worthy of pride. Gort was surprised. Can sea monsters also become mounts? There's no difference between sea monsters and World of Warcraft. If I can ride World of Warcraft, I can naturally ride sea monsters. Consultant Gort moved his gaze away from the land a little and looked at the sea. Everything on land can be found in the sea. Magic potions, elves, sea monsters, and those pearls. I understand, sir. It's just that it's a bit too sudden. You actually found 2 lesser sprites and 4 sprite worms in the sea, and all of them are giant algae sprites capable of growing magic medicine giant algae. This is simply inconceivable. Your news is a bit behind schedule. I currently have 3 giant algae sprites and 5 giant algae sprite worms. Moreover, List kept them guessing. It couldn't be said that he was keeping them in suspense. Rather, he was considering the pros and cons of whether or not he should reveal the existence of the giant kelp sprite Parker right now. But after thinking for 10 seconds he still decided to expose himself. The principle of not showing off one's wealth could be applied to little fire dragon Leo. As for a great elf, there was no need to be so nervous. As a Sky Knight, it was not a problem for him to obtain a great elf. Therefore, when Gort listened attentively, List said indifferently, "I also contracted a giant algae sprite in the giant algae forest." The reaction was as expected. Gort almost jumped up. "What? Sir, you were talking about a giant algae sprite? Great elf, that kind of great elf?" List stuttered, full of astonishment and disbelief, and his eyes were filled with astonishment. "No need to be surprised, it is indeed a great elf. It is not a sprite worm, nor is it a lesser sprite, but a great elf." List picked up the cup of green tea on the table and took a sip. "Its name is Parker. Because it is a wild great elf, it has yet to learn to speak and needs time to adapt to human life." Yes, a wild great elf needs time." Gort swallowed his saliva. He had yet to recover from his astonishment. List called over his valet Thomas. "Summon the town's officials, I want to hold a meeting." "Yes, master." After a moment, under the leadership of Marcus and Blair, the officials who remained in Port Town arrived one after another. List did not beat around the bush, directly saying, "I called you here tonight because I have good news to inform you. Today I found a giant algae sprite in the sea, and the contract has been completed. The territory's first great elf has been born, and its name is Parker." "Sir, did I hear wrong? Great elf. Giant algae sprite. Incredible. A great elf, how many magic ingredient giant algae can it produce?" All kinds of astonishment and exclamations rose and fell one after another. The officials were all caught off guard by the news of a great elf, leaving them dizzy. Great elves represented greater aristocrats. Clans with great elves could easily accumulate military merits and be conferred the title of count. After all, great elves represented the accumulation of wealth. Aristocrats had to work hard for generations to cultivate great elves. Some marquis families only had one or two great elves. List was only a viscount who had been in office for less than a year. But he had already become a Sky Knight, and had even obtained a great elf that could grow magic ingredients. The future of such a lord was so bright that one did not need to use their brains to imagine it. And as followers, following a lord with a promising future, naturally had many benefits. At this moment, all the followers were thanking the knight for his grace, including the knight who had been incorporated. Imperceptibly, the loyalty of the followers had increased substantially. List was satisfied with the reaction of his followers, but he still maintained his usual aristocratic demeanor, indifferent to honor or disgrace and indifferent. "I will send a knight to deliver a letter to Tulip Castle to set a time for the celebration. Teacher Marcus, I will leave this task to you." "As you wish, sir." Marcus appeared excited. He knelt on one knee and performed the knight etiquette. Looking at List, who was sitting in the seat of honor and calmly drinking tea, he seemed to see the knight's glory draped over his student like a cloak. He was once a commoner student of Coral Island's Knight Academy. Although his strength was not at the top, he was also a cultivation genius among commoners. Later, after advancing to the elite Earth Knight, he was appointed by the Count to be List's tutor, responsible for teaching List Knight cultivation. When they first met, he was full of ambition and was ready to assist List in his career. After all, he was not an aristocrat and was not qualified to follow the Count's heir, Levis. The second son of the Tulip family was the best target for him to follow. The second son needed to constantly fight in order to obtain aristocratic qualifications. However, at that time List was just a youth with poor aptitude and a timid character. He was not favored in the Tulip Castle. Of course. In the end, List was still made a baron, eliminating the need to struggle. However, Marcus was not happy at all. He did not think that List would go to war and fight for glory. Following such a lord would not allow him to achieve his aristocratic goals. Before setting off for Flower Town, he was in despair several times. But he could not disobey the Count's orders. However, List, who came to Flower Town, seemed to have changed into a different person, maturing from the inside out. What was even more surprising was that, starting from raising the flying dust dog Dosen, the knight's glory was constantly sprinkled on the territory, sprinkled on the lord. In a year, the originally mediocre List grew into an elite Earth Knight at an astonishing speed and defeated him. In the following 2 wars, his performance was even more extraordinary. The first time he participated in the development order, he broke through and became a Sky Knight, stunning the entire Coral Island. It was conceivable that even in the entire Grand Duchy of Sapphire, there would be aristocrats talking about the 17-year-old Sky Knight List. This represented the rise of another aristocratic star in the country. Just today, the youngest Sky Knight contracted a great sprite. Those great aristocratic families needed several generations of hard work to produce a great sprite. List got it so easily, as if he had gone through the struggle of several generations in just 2 or 3 years. There is no other identity that can describe him except the Son of Glory. Marcus's heart was burning, full of expectations for the future. To be a follower of the Son of Glory, glory was within reach. He even couldn't help but think, as a Son of Glory, how long will it take for List to become an earl, and how long will it take for him to become a marquis? He became a Sky Knight at the age of 17. Will there be the possibility of riding a dragon in the future? Riding a dragon may be slim. Chapter 546. The sound of horses' hooves was urgent. The tall tulip castle was already in sight. Marcus couldn't remember how many times he had visited the most magnificent castle on Coral Island. Since following List, going in and out of Tulip Castle had become a common occurrence. He walked on the road leading to the castle. Soon, a patrolling night squad came to greet him. The captain, who was obviously an acquaintance, greeted from a distance, "Captain Marcus." "Captain Schiller." After explaining the purpose of the message, the night squad immediately escorted Marcus to the castle gate. He had been here many times. Each time he could feel that the knight's gaze on him had changed. When he first went to the flower town, there were mostly ridiculing and contemptuous gazes. Everyone thought that he had lost the qualification to compete for the aristocracy. Later, when he came with Dosen, some people started to be surprised. After Ella was born, she finally enjoyed the envious gazes. The knight knew what a lesser sprite meant. Then, after the Battle of Ironhoof Island, List became famous, and the knight's gazes on him became even more envious. Then, after the development order, they became even more envious. After today, what kind of gazes will you look at me with? Marcus tried to keep calm, but his mood was so good that he wanted to sing. Of course, he had never sung before. His personality had always been serious and rigid. Even if he had a lot of inner drama, he was still unwilling to show it. The new deputy butler received him in the castle. "Captain Marcus, what brings you here today?" "I brought a message for Sir Lord to give to Sir Count." It turned out to be a message from young Master List. "Please wait in the living room, I will go inform the master." The deputy butler left for a moment before returning. "Captain Marcus, the master is upstairs in the study. He invites you to go." "Thank you." When he arrived at the door of the study, Marcus tidied up his clothes. He was still in awe of the count. After entering the door, he immediately performed the knight's etiquette. "Marcus pays respect to Sir Count." "Please sit down, Marcus." The count sat behind his desk, motioned for Marcus to sit down, and then asked, "What message did List ask you to bring me?" The distance between Flower Town and Tulip Castle is such a short distance. Riding a chocobo, he can get there in an hour, yet he still sent someone to deliver a message. "The Lord is dealing with important matters on Black Horse Island and has no time to leave, so he asked me to deliver the message." "All right, go ahead." Marcus cleared his throat and said sternly, "Sir Lord invites you and Madam to the Flower Town on April 14th to participate in the Great Sprite's birth celebration." At first, the Earl did not react. After waiting for 3 seconds, he suddenly came to his senses. "What did you say? The Great Elf's birth celebration?" "Yes." "List has a great sprite? Which elf evolved, Ella, Nami, or Mickey?" "Ella and Mickey have just evolved, and it seems unlikely that they will continue to evolve." "Is it the mangrove sprite Nami?" The Count was very clear about List's sprite. "Sir Count, the great sprite contracted by the Lord is not domesticated, but a wild great sprite. It is a giant kelp sprite. The Lord personally dived into the sea to explore the giant kelp forest composed of giant kelp, and found and contracted it. Its name is Parker." Marcus finished and added a few words. "Parker was born in the giant kelp forest. In addition, the Lord also found and contracted 3 giant kelp sprites, named Fitz, Tam, and Eddie, and 5 giant kelp sprite worms. 1 great sprite, 3 lesser sprites, and 5 sprite worms?" Even though the Count had been through a lot, he still opened his mouth wide. It took a while for him to recover from the shock. "Marcus, tell me what giant kelp is. Is there a forest in the sea? Are these sprites in the sea?" "Yes, Sir Count. Giant kelp is a kind of plant that grows on the bottom of the sea. It is tens or even hundreds of meters long. They grow densely together like a large seabed forest. Those giant kelp sprites live in the giant kelp forest. Moreover, the Lord also found a large area of magic ingredient giant kelp. Magic ingredient giant kelp? The Count exclaimed again. Marcus rarely saw the Count, who had always been high and mighty, lose his composure. However, he did not dare to show a different expression and replied respectfully, "Yes, there is a large area of magic ingredient giant kelp. The Lord has decided to expand the magic ingredient giant kelp in the sea and let all the giant kelp sprite worms cultivate the magic ingredient giant kelp." Stop for a moment. The Count waved his hand, then exhaled a long breath, leaned back in his chair and seemed to be lost in thought. After a while he recovered and his voice calmed down. "The sprites in the sea, this is a very surprising discovery. It is indeed necessary to hold a celebration after contracting so many sprites that can grow magic ingredients. The Lord will be looking forward to the arrival of you and his wife in Flower Town." "Don't look forward to it. I'm going to Black Horse Island." "By the way, where was the giant kelp forest found?" "On the shore of Black Horse Island." "You still have to inform the others. When you go back, tell List that I'm going to Black Horse Island the day after tomorrow to see the giant kelp forest and the great elf Parker in person." "Yes, I will convey your arrival to the Lord." Marcus bowed and left the study. The study was quiet. The Count leaned back in his chair but fell into deep thought. He was also a person who had a contract with a great elf, although the great elf Xiang had now been transferred to his son Levis. When he took over the contract from his father, Greg Tile, Xiang was still a little elf. Then soon the news of his father's death on the battlefield came. At that time he was just an Earth Knight, working hard to become stronger, hoping to avenge his father. Shortly afterward, Xiang suddenly broke through to become a great elf, and the family really ushered in the opportunity for development. Although he relied on his continuous development and war to be promoted to the Count, the foundation of the family was the cornerstone of success. Compared to List, he had almost no shortage of resources during his youth. However, now that he thought that List already had a great elf, 6 lesser elves, and dozens of sprite worms, he felt deeply conflicted. On the one hand, he was gratified that his son was favored by the knight. On the other hand, he was disappointed that his son had left him far behind. In terms of fighting, he could not beat his talented son, and now he was afraid that he could not even match his son in wealth. The Tulip family had a great elf, 12 lesser elves, and more than 100 sprite worms, but this was the harvest of more than 20 years of farming on Coral Island. The harvest of 3 years was simply not comparable to List's. Perhaps soon he will separate from the family. "Melissa, if you could see List's current achievements, you would be very happy. Your son has started a new family." The Count shook his head. Melissa had been dead for more than 10 years and should have been forgotten, but every time List achieved something, he could not help but think of his dead wife. Chapter 547. I just saw Marcus of Black Horse Island leave the castle. Why did he come here? Madame Marie walked into the Count's study, brought a cup of green tea and asked. She had recently been learning tea arts. List had sent a lot of tea from Flower Town, along with instructions on how to make tea. The Count appreciated the taste of green tea and had made green tea his daily drink. Madame Marie took the initiative to take on the tea-making skills. The Count, holding a teacup, said very calmly, "List found some sprites from the sea and is going to hold a celebration. He invited us to attend on April 14th. Madame Marie was stunned. "There are sprites in the sea? Why not in the sea? I used to see a great sprite of the Sapphire family on Blue Dragon Island. It was a water caltrop sprite that lived in a quiet lake. Large areas of water caltrops lived on the surface of the water. Since there are sprites in the lake, it is not surprising that there are sprites in the sea. The sea is so deep, how did he find it? I don't know. I plan to go to Black Horse Island the day after tomorrow. I haven't been to Black Horse Island since List was knighted. I'll take this opportunity to visit it carefully." The Count said and remembered something. "Go and prepare a heavy gift. The protagonist of this elven celebration is a giant algae sprite." Madame Marie was shocked. "Ah, a great sprite?" The Count put down his teacup and seemed to understand his wife's thoughts. He put his hand on her shoulder and rubbed it. "Its name is Parker. There are also 3 giant algae sprites and 5 giant algae sprite worms. This is a nest of sprites. I was as surprised as you when I heard it. Considering that List has the same luck as the Son of Glory, it does not seem difficult to understand. Dear, that is a great sprite. That is why I am proud of him." Madame Marie touched her chest and calmed her emotions. There was a complicated look in her eyes. I still can't believe it, a great sprite. How many generations of the tulip family have struggled to have a fragrance? It can't be compared to illusory luck. Maybe we should also search the sea around Coral Island. Of course I will do that, but the sea is different from the land. There are too many unknown dangers in the sea and it is difficult to develop. We can't throw civilians into the sea to farm. Then how did List develop those giant algae? I'm not sure. I'll know when I get there. You don't have to think too much about it. Prepare the gifts and if you're willing, come with me. Me? Madame Marie thought for a few seconds and shook her head. Forget it. I'll wait until April 14th. You and your father should have a good chat. After all, you are a family. He must have a special method to obtain the elves of the sea. The tulip family will prosper because of this technique. Southeast of Black Horse Island. On the surface of the sea near the shore, sampans were shuttling back and forth, harvesting large amounts of giant algae. These giant algae had been tested and found to be non-toxic and edible. However, they did not taste good. Livestock and poultry could eat the giant algae, but they could only eat it occasionally and could not be used as a staple food. Moreover, 80% of the giant algae was made of water. Although it looked huge, it had shrunk after being dried. But even so, it was still a very important aquatic product, effectively alleviating the demand for feed in the territory's animal husbandry. The purpose of the fishermen harvesting giant algae on such a large scale was to open up a new magic ingredient giant algae planting area. There was no magic ingredient in the area of influence of Parker's worm stalk, so List had used the temptation of jade powder and emotional communication to persuade Parker to migrate his worm stalk to the offshore area. Parker's worm stalk could cover an area of more than 6,000 acres, almost covering all the offshore areas suitable for the growth of giant algae at once. Coupled with Fitz, Tam, Eddie's worm stalk, and the original 5 giant algae worms, it could basically affect thousands of acres of the sea. The entire offshore area would be planted with the magic ingredient giant algae, and other areas would be left to ordinary giant algae to grow. It didn't matter if it grew well or poorly, ensuring the magic ingredient was the most important. A few kilometers away from the area where the fishermen harvested the giant algae, the sea was slightly rippling. Suddenly, there was a splash of water and a big colorful fish rushed out of the water, with a person riding on its back. It was List, who was searching for the giant algae forest, and his new mount, Lolth. Phew. On Lolth's back, List exhaled a mouthful of turbid air and said in a relieved tone, "It took a week to completely clean up the giant algae forest. Unfortunately, there were not many discoveries in the deep water area, only 3 giant algae worms. In total, we harvested 8 giant algae worms." In the last 2 days of searching, he had only found 3 giant algae sprite worms. The giant algae forest, which had an area of 36,000 acres, had bred a greater sprite, 3 lesser sprites and 8 sprite worms. It was definitely a huge treasure trove of the sea. Achi also surfaced. She looked at List with a somewhat distressed expression. "Big brother, Achi's shell is in a mess. Fitz, Tam and Eddie are not honest at all. The 8 giant algae worms also often bully the kelp worm, the seaweed worm, the redstone flower worm, the horsetail worm and the black horn worm." Her shell was indeed very big, but unfortunately the giant algae sprites had a bad temper. Not only were the greater sprites savage, the lesser sprites vicious, even the peaceful and quiet sprite worms would occasionally show their tyrannical side. When Achi was not paying attention, they would always bully other sprite worms or make a move on each other. "I will have people expand the Flower Town Seascape Villa into a small seaside castle specifically for the sea sprites to live in. Each sprite will have 1 room and no one will violate anyone else. A new castle will soon be built in the port town. At that time, Achi, you will also have your own room." "Achi will also have one? Of course, you are my little sister. Although your identity cannot be exposed for the time being, but you will still be the castle's master," List said with a smile. Achi revealed a happy smile and asked, "Can Achi have a bigger magic laboratory?" "Of course." "All right, thank you, big brother. If it were not for the difficulty of building a building in the sea, I would even be willing to build you an underwater wizard tower in the sea." List made a bold statement. In any case, there was no need to realize it. Achi will be very satisfied with a bigger magic laboratory. How could List not dote on such a considerate little siren who knew how to save money? He motioned for Achi to stretch her head over and gently ruffle her beautiful blue hair. At this moment, Achi was like a kitten, squinting her big eyes and enjoying List's touch. The sea was so warm that even Lolth only uttered a soft sound, not wanting to disturb them. Quietly and attentively, List summoned the smoke mission. The mission had not changed, indicating that it had not been completed. The mission requirement was to place all the worm stalks and plan the giant algae forest. He had not yet had the time to place the giant algae worm's worm stalk that he had discovered today in the coastal waters. Thus, after a moment of warm interaction, together with a chi and riding Lolth, he swam towards the coastal waters. He had a complete plan and knew where to place the worm stalk. At the same time. Chapter 548. How is that possible? A sprite can be found in the sea, and a greater sprite with a group of lesser sprites at that. Impossible. Levis shook his head, still in disbelief. Marcus, who had delivered the letter, had already left, but the impact of the letter had yet to subside. Loria, who had already become slightly pregnant, was sorting out the account books. She had already assumed the role of the husband and wife's estate manager. Of course there are sprites in the sea. My father once found 2 swamp sprite worms in a river. If there are sprites in the river, then there must be sprites in the sea. I just don't know how List found the sprites in the sea. But they are greater sprites. Dear, aren't you surprised? What do I need to be surprised about? The golden barley family has 2 greater sprites. The golden barley family also has a greater sprite. Among my father's followers, several counts also have greater sprites. List is already the youngest Sky Knight in the country, so shouldn't he have a greater sprite? Loria had a matter-of-fact expression. Levis opened his mouth and almost choked. Almost all greater sprites are raised by domestic lesser sprites, but List's giant algae greater sprite is wild. This luck is too enviable. He is a son of glory. Of course I know that he is favored by the knight's glory, but my heart is a little unbalanced. Loria looked up at him. Levis, I know that you have been a genius of the Coral Island since childhood, while List has not been talented since childhood, which makes you feel unbalanced. But you need to accept reality. He is a Sky Knight, and even my father praised him for his bright future in his letter. Now, our business is provided by List, so you should learn to be grateful. Loria, don't get it wrong, we are the ones who provided him with the channel. If List was just the second son of an ordinary aristocrat, then as a channel supplier, we should certainly get more profits. Loria's tone was calm, but she dominated the conversation. But he is not an ordinary second son. He is a Sky Knight, a future greater aristocrat. My father believes that he will even surpass her father's achievements. This isn't quite possible. Father is a strong contender for the Marquis title. I cannot say for sure what will happen in the future, but my father's vision is not bad. The brilliance of List's genius shone even on the countryside serfs of the Coral Island. We cannot turn a blind eye to it. Regardless of whether he has a contract with a great elf or not, I intend to suggest that you and List renegotiate the division of the business. We can't take the biggest share anymore, we should at least split it evenly. Levis did not speak. He was reluctant to give up his share of the business. Luolia said calmly, Levis, you will inherit everything from the Tulip family in the end. What you need to do now is to train hard and break through to become a Sky Knight. Only in this way can we gain the upper hand in the confrontation with Madame Marie and stop the flow of resources to Lytton. If I don't have enough resources, how can I break through quickly? It is precisely because you don't have enough resources that you can compete with Madame Marie for resources and restrain Lytton. List is your younger brother, you can rely on him. Lytton, however, cannot let him become the next List. After Luolia finished speaking, she lowered her head and continued to calculate the accounts. Levis looked at his wife and suddenly felt a little cold. However, he quickly shook off this feeling and said, You don't have to worry about Lytton. List is a son of glory, but he is not. His talent is indeed good, becoming an Earth Knight at the age of 13, but that's all. Well, I will take care of the gifts and the business. You should concentrate on your training. In the small castle next to the Coral City, Madame Penelope was busy selecting potted plants. From time to time she would communicate with Elvira behind her. What do you think of this pot of azalea? Does it look like it is going to breed a sprite worm? I can't see it. Of course you can't see it. You don't have the Knight of Glory's favor. You can't even find a suitable companion, let alone a sprite worm. Grandmother, how can you say that about me? Young lady, quickly find an aristocratic knight and marry yourself off, then I will be polite to you. Weren't you always worried about List's marriage some time ago? Why are you suddenly targeting me? Elvira had a depressed expression. In the past, List was a young man with potential and needed me, his grandmother, to worry about him. But now he is the rising star of the Grand Duchy's aristocracy. Naturally, aristocrats will come to his door to ask for a marriage alliance. Those aristocratic ladies will compete to be his wife, so there is no need to waste time looking for one. Olvera said, but I can see that Liszt has no intention of looking for one. He is not in a hurry because he is still young and prioritizes his career and training. A talented and diligent aristocrat like him will never lack suitors. I believe that on your father's side, there are already many aristocrats communicating with him about children. This is also true. Now that Liszt has contracted a greater sprite that can plant magic ingredients, oh heavens, I can imagine how many aristocratic ladies would regard him as their Prince Charming. Perhaps the Grand Duke regrets not having a third princess. Don't casually tease the Grand Duke. Aren't there only you and me here? You should know that the Grand Duke may send someone to inspect Liszt at any time. Such a young man with potential should choose to pledge allegiance to the Grand Duke instead of following your father. With a greater sprite and being the youngest Sky Knight, he is enough to establish a new family and propagate the Tulip family. While speaking, Madame Penelope pointed at a potted sunflower and said to the servant, "Move this potted plant to the place with the best sunlight. It will be my gift to Liszt. Maybe a sprite worm is being gestated." Olvera rolled her eyes. "I don't see any signs of it breeding a sprite worm." "You can't, but Liszt can. Perhaps I should let him choose one himself." "Forget it, later he can come and pick my potted plant whenever he wants." "You are too biased. If you can strengthen the family, I will also be biased towards you," Madame Penelope said before suddenly sighing with emotion. "If your grandfather were still alive, he would definitely be very pleased. His son brought glory to the family with the surname Tulip, and his grandson is about to establish a new family. How glorious!" Liszt did not know that others were talking about him behind his back. Of course, even if he did not know, he could still guess the impact he had on others. A wild greater sprite was casually contracted just like that. Anyone would be green with envy and indescribable shock. However, with the continuous improvement of Dragon Chi and the continuous production of giant algae magic ingredients, his and the little charred dragon's strength had increased by leaps and bounds. They simply did not care about how others viewed them. Reaching the top, looking down at the mountains. That was probably the feeling. He rode the seven-colored whale Lolth, constantly rushing on the sea, commanding his officials, organizing serfs to harvest the giant algae, and burying the mature part of the giant algae magic ingredient in the harvested sea area, experimental planting. He was busy until April 13th. Only then did he thoroughly plan the sea area. After Port Town, Newport Town, Thorns Town, Horse Town, Green Tea Town, Grain Town, Red River Town, and Mushroom Town, he decided to build a ninth town, a giant algae town. This town will fully operate the giant algae industry and ancillary fisheries. Chapter 549. Quest completed. Reward, Pro-producing shells. Quest. The Mage Tower is about to be built, and the Magic Academy is about to start enrolling students. Crazy Truth is ready, but the magician assistant needed has not arrived. The Lord will solve this problem. Reward, Floating Fruit. The reward was issued and the new quest was issued. Liszt looked at the changing smoke and thought for a moment. The shell that produces pearls is probably similar to the pearl oysters raised by the sapphire family? I don't know how strong this sea monster is and what kind of pearls it produces. It's time to find a magician assistant. But what does this floating fruit mean? It was probably some kind of edible fruit that drifted along the ocean. Liszt guessed so. But it was unknown if it could be eaten. Now it was time to do the quest. In fact, he had sent a letter to Elksun Truth, hoping to hire him as a teacher in the Magic Academy. However, Elksun had discovered the charm of being a second-hand dealer. He didn't want to do any research or teaching at all. He just wanted to be free. Although he settled in Coral City, he often went to the outer islands to experience different customs and do business with all kinds of people. Of course, Liszt was always his best customer. If he wanted to make money, he had to come to Flower Town. It was already difficult to do magic casting. Without so much magic, he was now mainly selling magic books. He even wrote to Liszt recently to go to the Iron and Steel Ridge Kingdom. He contacted a magic gathering and went there to buy more magic books. Elksun Truth was unwilling to come, Glanny Truth was stubborn, and there was also Mylisai Truth who was dead. In addition, there was a magician who cooperated with the Tulip family, but Liszt couldn't recruit him. Let's contact Glanny. Although this guy is stubborn and self-righteous, he is very skilled in making magic equipment. With a great magician like Chris as bait, he probably won't refuse. Then we can recruit 2 more magicians from other places. That should be enough to support the Magic Academy. List immediately sent a retainer knight to contact Glanny, and then wrote to Levis, asking Levis to help recruit 2 magicians from the outer islands. List did this well. It was April 14th, and the celebration of the birth of the great elf was about to begin. Except for a few supervisors who stayed on Black Horse Island, other officials and knight had gathered in Flower Town. Under the guidance of Butler Carter, the servants of the castle were busy and orderly arranging the banquet. In the past 2 years, the castle had held many banquets and had accumulated a lot of experience. Therefore, everything was proceeding in an orderly manner. Although the commoners of the small town did not have a holiday, everyone received double their salary today to celebrate with Sir Lord. In the apple orchard in front of the castle, Docen and Stupid Woman snuggled up to each other, lazily basking in the sun. The 8 blizzard beasts were locked in 4 cages and could not come out. Their destructive power was too strong. Once released, they would form a litter of dogs. Without List's restraint, it would be a disaster. In front of List, they were a well-trained blizzard beast squad. List turned around and left. They were fearless troublemakers and the servants could not stop them. Once they even blocked the main road of Flower Town with rock thorns. It took the serfs a few days of effort to restore traffic on the main road. Now they have learned a new magic, rock grenades. As for the other 2 magic that Docen knew, rock wall and stone armor, they have not yet learned and do not know if they can learn it. Their aptitude seems to be much worse than Docen's. If Docen is a mid-level intermediate World of Warcraft, then they are an inferior intermediate World of Warcraft, probably because half of their bloodline originated from Stupid Woman. Stupid Woman is just a low-level World of Warcraft flying dust dog. On the pasture further away, there were not many horses being raised. The horses originally raised in the castle had been transferred to the Black Horse Ranch. Only the caravan and the riding horses were still grazing on the pasture. The blind and lame groom, One-Eyed Barton, still took care of the horses dutifully. From time to time, he would brag to the 5 horse grooms behind him, "I have been to the Black Horse Ranch, where I have delivered many of the divine black blood horses. Even Lord Gort invited me to go to the Knight Academy as a horse teacher." Then he would sing praises for List. "The Lord is kind and great. He gave old Barton a good life. His greatness is like the sun, illuminating every corner of the territory. Even the great elves in the sea are subdued by him. Ah, what a great lord." With an aria ending, One-Eyed Barton was very satisfied with his lines. And the lord that he spoke of was as great as the sun. At this time in the Seascape Villa. After a few days of rushing work, the Seascape Villa has changed greatly. It was originally a small 2-story building, but now it has been expanded into a row of 3-story buildings, towering in the sea. They were all built when the tide was low. Rubber water can quickly solidify in a few minutes. It is simply a construction artifact. Rocks are inexhaustible. The blizzard beast produces a lot of rocks every day. Now some wealthy civilians in Flower Town have begun to buy rocks to build houses. They replaced wooden houses with stone houses, which are fireproof, soundproof and quite stable. However, rubber water is not sold to the public. They can only use ordinary grass ash and mud to solidify the stones. For a long time, the rubber output of the rubber trees could not meet the needs of the territory's infrastructure. Even if every month List would let the triplets of the rubber worm exert the power of the 3 phases to restore the rubber trees. "My lord, the seaside castle has been built. You can let the elves live in it." Isaiah came over and reported. List nodded. He took out a whistle from his pocket. The whistle was his latest invention. Of course, he just came up with an idea, and the rest was left to the carpenters in the carpentry workshop to figure out. After constant exploration, they finally designed a whistle that could be blown very loudly. This is a cylindrical whistle, not the kind that looks like a snail. He held it in his mouth and blew it. Suddenly, a sharp sound pierced the sea. After dozens of seconds, a huge colorful fish came to the beach along the artificially dug ditch. It was the 7-colored whale, Lolth, who could already understand the whistle. List turned over and rode it, diving directly into the sea in front of the eyes of many officials and serfs. Many people who saw List riding the 7-colored whale for the first time let out exclamations one after another. But not too long after the exclamation, List had already ridden the 7-colored whale and emerged from the sea. He rode all the way to the seaside castle. The officials entered the seaside castle one after another. Then they saw List with 1 big and 4 small elves on him, holding a handful of sprite worms in his hand. He turned over and got off the back of the 7-colored whale. Along the steps in the sea he put the elves into different small rooms in turn. Elves are very wonderful, they actually spend most of their time sleeping. Even if they have a personality, it will be constantly smoothed out in the contract, and eventually, they will not be able to resist the master's orders. Liszt ordered them to stay in their respective rooms and built beds with jade stones, which was enough to let them settle down. Each room had a side installed with glass for viewing and to ensure that the elves were in good condition. The officials stood in front of the glass, gesturing at the elves. "That is the giant kelp sprite Parker. Sure enough, it is beautiful. I have seen Tulip Castle's great sprite sweet fragrance. Parker is as beautiful as it. Its teeth have a bit of a personality. So many elves, all born from giant kelp, amazing. Praise sir, praise the giant kelp. Parker is the embodiment of knight's glory, only Sir Lord can be favored by it." Amidst the praises, Liszt had already taken a bath in the next room and changed into a fitted frack abbey. Just then, a retainer knight rushed over and reported to him, "Sir, Tulip Castle's carriage has entered the main road of the Thorns Ridge and will soon arrive at the castle. Lead them directly to the seaside castle, I will wait for them here." "Yes, sir." 20 minutes later, the carriage slowly arrived at the oyster settlement along the main road. Madame Penelope, the Count and his wife, Levis and his wife, Olvera Lytton and the others alighted one after another. Grandmother, father, Madame Marie, Levis, Rolia, Olvera Lytton, welcome to the celebration of the birth of the great sprite Parker. Oh Liszt, my lucky boy, grandmother can't wait to see the great sprite Parker. Chapter 550. The waves washed over them and the thick transparent glass blocked the seawater. The elves were soaking in the seawater, sleeping soundly. The crowd of visitors stood behind the glass, chattering in admiration and comments. It was a bit similar to the underwater glass passages in marine parks. "Look what a beautiful big elf. Parker, Parker, it looks so round but it doesn't have wings," Madame Penelope said with a smile. Olvera then said, "Elves are the most beautiful creatures. They are like huge gems, more beautiful than gems. No wings but fins. Is this the difference between sea elves and land elves?" Levis stretched his head, wanting to get closer to the glass to take a closer look. At this time, Parker seemed to feel movement outside the glass from the soundproof room. He got up while rubbing his eyes in a daze. When he turned around he saw a large group of people peeping at him. He suddenly became furious and opened his mouth to curse. "Gulu, Anjur, this mouth. Its fangs were exposed." Madame Marie exclaimed on the spot, How can its teeth be so sharp?" Liszt, while shouting at Parker's unfriendly behavior in his heart, explained with a smile, "A mouth full of fangs is indeed not very beautiful, but they are wild elves. Having sharp teeth is probably better for them to protect themselves. After all, there are countless dangers hidden in the sea. Even we humans can't survive there, let alone elves. Don't care what its teeth look like. It is a big elf and its value is the most important." Madame Penelope gave Madame Marie a contemptuous look, pulled Liszt and said with a gentle smile, "Grandmother has seen these elves. You have brought too much glory to the family." Liszt said modestly, "The knight is blessed by glory. I just went for a swim in the sea and encountered them." This was a joke, but it caused many people behind him to have a toothache. Only Rolia laughed, "Because you are the son of glory, these elves took the initiative to appear in front of you and accept your contract." "I think so too." The elves obviously didn't have to visit for too long. 15 minutes later, under Liszt's lead, everyone left the castle by the sea. Then he watched as Liszt used the whistle to command the rainbow whale Lolth to play on the beach for a while, exclaiming in admiration that it was beautiful, magical, and glorious. Before he knew it, it was already 11 o'clock. The sun rose into the sky and the temperature began to rise. The group returned to the carriage and returned to the castle. There were not many guests invited to the celebration of the great elf's birth, mainly Liszt's own followers and members of the Tulip family. The other nobles were the Count's followers and Liszt did not want to rope them in. Now that he was a Sky Knight, he could leave the Count at any time and pledge loyalty to the Grand Duke. After all, Lee William's title had limited Liszt's future. Even if he did not take the initiative to leave, the Count would have persuaded him to do so. In the living room on the second floor, there was only the family and Gort, the Lord Knight who was there to lighten the mood. The first floor was a lively place for the territorial officials and Knight to chat. Madame Penelope drank the best green tea that Liszt had brought out for her. The old lady didn't seem to like green tea. She only took a sip and put it down. she asked List very solemnly. My young man, you already have your own great elf. Usually, nobles who have their own great elf will choose to change their surname and start a new family. For example, in Rolia's grandfather's generation, the Golden Wheat family was divided into two families, the Golden Wheat Ears and the Golden Wheat Grains. What do you think? Levis directly interjected, you can change your surname to Giant Algae family. It sounds very wonderful. My dear brother, in the blink of an eye, you can already start a new family. Giant Algae family, List Giant Algae, I also think it's pretty good. Olvera echoed. Even Lytton said, if those giant algae are really dozens of meters long, Big Brother's Giant Algae family feels really domineering. List smiled. Then he responded faintly, Grandmother, when Father visited Black Horse Island the day before yesterday, I talked to him about it. He glanced at the Count. The Count also nodded in time. List has his own ideas. I don't intend to change my surname, and I have no idea of starting a new family for the time being. After all, I am still very young and I want to stabilize my foundation first. Father said that the Grand Duke may have sent someone to inspect me. Maybe in 2 years I will be loyal to the Grand Duke. At that time we can talk about the surname and family. He did talk to the Count in detail. 3 days ago the Count boarded Black Horse Island by boat. List accompanied him around Black Horse Island, visiting various small towns, diving into the sea and enjoying the giant algae forest. The father and son also talked a lot. After all, the Count knew that he was not List's opponent, and he had already regarded List as an equal in his mentality. Especially when he saw the prosperous development of the Black Horse Island territory, the magic-driven Black Horse Kiln Factory and Glass Workshop, the gray-white Mage Tower rising from the ground, the handsome black blood horses. Everything had given him a deeper understanding of his second son. I know you are hiding a secret. Is there anything you want to tell me? Standing on the dock of Giant Algae Town, the Count asked with emotion as he looked at the sampan carrying giant algae in the distance. The situation of Black Horse Island. As long as someone investigated a little, they would know that there were many obvious places where the situation stood out. List did not hide much, so he was not surprised by the Count's question. I do have some secrets or luck. Father, do you believe in the Son of Glory? I don't believe that the glory of the night can favor a person, but hard work is the key to glory. Compared with most humans who believe in the glory of the night, Lee William, as a veteran holy swordsman, sees problems more clearly and understands the essence of things. List said the words he had prepared. When I first came to Flower Town, I mistakenly ate a poisonous fruit in Thorn's Ridge and almost died. This is my negligence, I used to ignore you too much. These are all in the past. In fact, I got a blessing in disguise. Not only did I survive, but it also triggered some changes in my body. My innate talent was completely revealed, and most importantly, my eyes could sense magic. So, as you can see, I found a lot of elves. Oh, is that so? The Count was surprised. He had thought about all kinds of secrets of List, but he did not expect it to be such a secret. List nodded. He could not reveal the secret of the smoke mission, which involved too much. After all, it was related to the smoke dragon. It was also impossible to reveal the secret of the gem space, which also involved the invisible dragon. The little fire dragon Leo could not be revealed. Perhaps the Count would keep the secret for him and even be willing to sponsor him to ride a dragon. But there was no guarantee that the Count could really keep the secret. In case Madame Marie found out and in case she accidentally leaked it. There would definitely be people who would quietly sell the secret of the fire dragon for their own benefit. At that time, List would be in big trouble. Even though he was not afraid of people coming to the door, he could ride the colorful whale Lolth and wander the world at any time. But Black Horse Island could not be kept, and his efforts over the years would be in vain. So, choosing other secrets to distract the Count's attention was the best way. He could not hope that the Count would always ignore the abrupt phenomena on Black Horse Island. Just like the potion giant seaweed, he could choose to hide the news of the great elf, but the constant production of potions could not be hidden from the attention of people, and it would eventually be exposed. Instead of waiting for the future to be passive, it was better to actively guide interference. It just so happened that the Count was coming to Black Horse Island for sightseeing, so he took the opportunity to guide him. He originally intended to throw out the magic eye secret technique, but in the end he was not willing to do so, so he said that his eyes were mutated. Finally, the Count chose to accept this statement. This is a mutation that others dream of. Perhaps I should not deny the Son of Glory. The changes that have happened to you are in itself the deep blessing of the night's glory. List, you will create a big family that surpasses the tulip family. Father, I hope to help you become a marquis. After that, I will work hard and strive to become a marquis myself. List smiled. This was not without the subtext of the deal. The Count no longer delved into his secrets, and he helped the Count fight for the marquis title. Of course, the main reason was that List did not like the surname Giant Seaweed. Chapter 551. The Count stayed on Black Horse Island for half a day, exchanging a lot of information with List about the sea elves before leaving. List did not choose to hold back. Developing the sea was very difficult for people today. Without a mount like the seven-colored whale, and without a siren sister like a chi, diving could only be done near the coast. However, it was almost impossible for a sprite worm near the coast to be found by diving. Without the magic eye, looking for worm stalks with the naked eye was tantamount to looking for a needle in a haystack. In fact, according to the Count's introduction, many great aristocrats are aware of the existence of sprites in the sea, but few people are willing to develop them. The plants that sea sprites grow are also in the sea. How much technology, manpower, and material resources are needed to farm in the sea? Moreover, most of the algae in the sea seem to have little value apart from being used as livestock feed. If there were no magic giant algae found in the giant algae forest, just ordinary giant algae would not be worth List's effort to develop. It would be better to spend more effort on farming on shore than to cultivate giant algae. But with the magic giant algae it was different. Spending a little more to plant the magic herb in the sea would still yield huge benefits, not to mention that the production of the magic giant algae was very large. So in summary, there was no one else besides List who could develop sprite worms in the sea. Of course, he was not afraid of exchanging his skills. In short, the Count circled Black Horse Island. The travel experience was probably not that pleasant. 3 days later, at the celebration of the Great Sprite's birth, his impression of the giant algae sprite Parker was also not so good. It was not that Parker's teeth destroyed his whole face, nor was it that Parker's value was not great. But thinking that the sea sprites could not be developed, and it was almost impossible to find a giant algae sprite like Parker, he was depressed. Before boarding Black Horse Island, he came with excitement. Although Madame Marie urged him behind the scenes, he himself was eager to have a new source of sprite worms. Unfortunately, only his son had the benefits. Why can't I meet a sea monster mount in World of Warcraft? He was still complaining about how amazed he was when he heard List talk about the magic of the seven-colored whale Lolth, the seven-colored breathing film. It allowed people to breathe in the sea. This was completely trampling on the sea like it was land. The fire of jealousy burned in the Count's heart. Unfortunately, the other party was his second son, so he couldn't directly snatch it. Even if it wasn't his own son, it seemed that he couldn't beat List at all. Loki flying in the sky, Rose swimming in the water, plus a group of blizzard beasts, this person alone was a legion. Therefore, he could only patiently lean against the back of the chair and continue to listen to List's seemingly casual conversation. But in fact, he was showing off. At this moment, the whole family was talking about List's new castle. List said, I plan to build a 5-story castle because Black Horse Island is flat and there are no steep cliffs to rely on as barriers, so I can only build it taller. Although it's a bit empty for me to live in such a big castle alone, you can also go to my castle for a vacation. Have you thought of a name for the castle? Loria asked. I haven't decided yet. Call it Kelp Castle. Like Tulip Castle, it's the name of a great elf. Vera suggested. List smiled and denied, actually I prefer to call it Thorn Castle. He snapped his fingers and suddenly there was a cry of wow in the castle. The next moment, the thorn sprite Ella had flown over and landed on List's shoulder, yawning. He continued, Parker is a sea elf. It doesn't like to live in a castle and Ella is my first elf. It makes more sense to name the castle after it. Wow. Ella didn't know what List was talking about, but it didn't prevent it from echoing List's words. Of all the elves, List liked Ella the most even though Ella had a bad temper. This was his first elf, and he personally felt its unyielding attitude towards fate. The thorn's worm, which was never valued, broke out of its cocoon and became a butterfly, and turned into a little elf who planted magic potions. He still remembered the shock of seeing Ella stretch out her hand from under the gray, fat pupa of the thorn's worm. He was used to Ella rudely turning over his food at every banquet, eating and throwing it away. Ella was not the most precious of the elves, but in his heart, it was the most special. Lady Penelope looked at Ella and pretended to sigh. Oh, my poor Parker, not only did it not become a family name, but even the castle doesn't have its name. She was a little unhappy that List didn't change his surname, create a new family and gain glory. Let's call the castle Thorn Castle. List didn't want to discuss it anymore. But after the port town develops into a city, I can name it Kelp City. There was no need to elaborate on the liveliness of the luncheon. Amidst the compliments of the night's glory, the delicacies were served to the table in turn. After the meal, the crowd also enjoyed a brand new stage play, The Loyal Hymn of the Valsai Knight, in which Avril Mask played the heroine and left a deep impression on everyone. There was a burst of applause. Lady Penelope in particular liked this new form of stage play very much. So beautiful. Compared to those monotonous burlesques, this kind of play is more moving. It's the same art as piano music. I want to stay here and watch their performances every day. List responded, this is a play choreographed by the Black Horse Island Drama Company. For the time being, they are still working hard to train the newcomers. After a while, when the performance is mature, I will let them go to Coral Island to perform. You can watch their wonderful performance at home, as well as a richer repertoire. That's great. I can't wait to see them perform on Coral Island. Lady Penelope said, asking her servant to grab a handful of copper coins and throw them on the stage. This was the main income of the burlesque show, which relied on the audience's rewards. However, List was not going to charge in this way. He chose to rent a house and transform it into a theater, build a large stage indoors, and then sell tickets to the public, taking the high-end route. After watching The Loyal Hymn of the Valsai Knight, the celebration of the birth of the great elf was officially over. List personally sent the convoy away from the castle. He knew that the name Parker would quickly spread throughout Coral Island and to more distant islands with the departure of the convoy. Chapter 552. This chapter is a reward for the leader of the Alliance, Slacker Man. 1 chapter for now, 10 more chapters in the future. Peace was restored in the territory. The officials and knight all returned to their posts. Apart from the commoners who received double their wages, they also praised the leader and great elf Parker. The influence of the giant kelp sprites had subsided. After the afternoon nap, List rode the chocobo Loki to a remote place to drink potions with Charmander. Crazy's endless supply of giant kelp potions really made the man and dragon happy every day. Scorching sun stab. In the air, List became one with his sword and crashed to the ground. His surging chi smashed into the ground like the sun. Huge flames shot out in all directions, burning a huge pit in the ground. Bathed in flames, List maintained a half-squatting position, calming his sudden burst of chi. Roar! Charmander Leo, circling in the sky, saw List covered in flames. He folded his wings and landed on the edge of the pit. Then he opened his mouth and spat out a faint yellow flame dragon breath. The dragon breath instantly enveloped List's body. But it didn't cause him any harm. Instead, it constantly permeated his body, helping him expand the capacity of his cells. This was the newest training method that List and Leo had come up with. He named it Dragon Breath Body Refinement. He named the training method of excreting impurities after becoming one with the dragon, Demonic Dragon Chi Refinement. Demonic Dragon Chi Refinement was to upgrade Dragon Chi, while Dragon Breath Body Refinement was to expand the capacity of his cells. 2 different training methods, but both were constantly increasing List's strength. Even though he didn't get the Grand Duke's Dragon Knight Chi manual, he still figured out how to train as a Dragon Knight. Actually, it couldn't be said that he figured it out alone. Demonic Dragon Chi Refinement was a function of Charmander. As for Dragon Breath Body Refinement, there was one time when Leo took the initiative to spit dragon breath at him. At the time, List was shocked, thinking that Leo was trying to kill him. In the end, it was a false alarm. He discovered that dragon breath had the properties of a magic potion, helping him expand the capacity of his cells. So now, List basically gave all the magic potions to Leo to ingest, and then Leo would help him refine his demonic dragon chi and refine his body with dragon breath, striving to become a dragon knight. Unfortunately, Leo was still too young and had very little dragon breath. After spitting for a while, it hung its head dejectedly, looking exhausted. Catch. List stuffed 10 giant algae potions into its mouth. Charmander, who had been dejected just a moment ago, suddenly became spirited again. It stamped its legs and rushed into the sky. After circling around for a while, it suddenly turned into a ball of flames and rushed into List's body. List shook his clothes that had turned to ashes and said threateningly, "You're full of vigor when you're taking pills, but you're sneaky when you're helping me cultivate. Leo, you can't escape." Being ridden by me is your destiny. Leo roared in disdain. List just chuckled. No matter how clever the small Charmander was, it was still just a young dragon. No matter how cunning a fox was, it could not beat a veteran hunter. Now that he had sketched the List dragon taming manual in his mind, sooner or later, he would create a dragon riding masterpiece that was more detailed than the Dragon Knight Chi secret manual. It would be passed on to his heirs from generation to generation. After changing into a new set of clothes, he whistled. Clatter. Not far away, Loki, who was grazing, strode over with its long legs. It would not refuse to be ridden by List. List rewarded it with a handful of top-grade wheat grains. List ordered, "Let's go home." Early the next morning, Glanny Truth tidied up his magic experiment tools and took a carriage to the Flower Town. He had accepted the recruitment of the Magic College to serve as a magic equipment class teacher and teach the first batch of Magic College students. List received Glanny. He still showed respect to the stubborn wizard. "Mr. Glanny, then I will have to trouble you with the teaching of the Magic College. Viscount, please rest assured." Glanny looked aloof, but in the face of List, who was promoted to a Sky Knight, he knew to maintain the proper etiquette and spoke politely. "Take a boat to Black Horse Island, someone will receive you. The Mage Tower has just been built, and the Magic College is on the first floor of the Mage Tower. Your daily life will be arranged by a special person in charge. I hope you will have a good life on Black Horse Island." "Thank you for the trouble, Viscount." Glanny did not stay in Flower Town and took today's merchant ship to Black Horse Island. Unfortunately, only one wizard had arrived, and the other two wizards who had accepted the recruitment had not yet arrived at Coral Island, so the smoke mission was still uncompleted. He did not know what kind of floating fruit the reward would be. He practiced multiple arrows in the apple orchard. He pondered for a moment the triangle theory and magic array structure unification demonstration. He was not a wizard, but this was the second magic book he had created. The last book, Tri-State Magic Array and Reality Interaction Theory, was praised by Chris Truth. "According to the clues I have now, the products formed by magic should be independent of the material sequence, or independent of the physical category, and included in the separate category of magic." He wrote a string of characters on the blank thick bast paper. Magic molecules, runes, magic arrays, and magic elves and dragons. In his mind, magic molecules are the basic units of magic. Magic molecules are arranged and combined into runes, and runes form magic arrays and construct various magic. Different levels of magic arrays have different power and effects, and higher levels of magic arrays are likely to be magic creatures. The so-called magic creatures include World of Warcraft, elves, dragons, sirens, and so on. Even wizards are considered artificial magic creatures. They are all direct users of runes and magic arrays. The difference is that World of Warcraft and the body of a wizard belong to the physical category, but they also have the ability of magic. Elves, dragons, and sirens not only have the ability of magic, but even their bodies also belong to the magic category. The body of a dragon is producing all the time, and the same is true for elves. Even the siren Chi is very different from human beings, and seems to be an incarnation of magic. Perhaps there are two sets of basic rules in this world, one is the physical rules, and the other is the magic rules, which interfere with each other and are independent of each other. Coupled with the spiritual rules in the middle, this strange world is formed. This is the theme I want to elaborate. For a time, ideas flowed. After the historical inventor's masterpiece Dragons Fight in the Wild was completely stalled, the Piano King's famous Liszt piano music collection temporarily subsided, and after the small test of Tri-State Magic Array and Reality Interaction Theory, and Liszt's Earth Codex, he became a magic theorist again. He devoted himself to the creation of triangle theory and magic array structure unification demonstration. The 30,000-word masterpiece finally came to an end today. Looking at the 15 pages of thick bast paper with stale ink and more than 9 sets of hand-drawn schematics, he was very satisfied. He was going to give it to a Chi for reference first, wait for her opinion to come out, make slight revisions, and then give it to Chris for reference. Chapter 553. This chapter is for the headmaster. Falling leaves, yes. 1 chapter for now and 5 more chapters in the future. When Liszt arrived at the seaside castle, he happened to find a Chi talking to Parker. He had to say that the elves were easy to coax. After only a few days of contact, the jade powder was in place, and Parker no longer resisted a Chi. Even Lolth, the rainbow whale, could play around the seaside castle without being attacked by Parker. Not to mention the three little elves, Fitz, Tam, and Eddie, who were already excited to see Chi. It made List suspect that if the contract could be revoked, these three little guys might quickly fall into Chi's arms. List. List. Parker shouted when he saw List. List crossed the glass door and stood on the shore of the room. He waved to Parker. Parker, study hard. Parker grinned, showing off his teeth in a dramatic way. He pointed at List, then at Chi, and then at himself. List, Chi, Parker, a family. Then he pointed to the rainbow whale Lolth outside and said disdainfully, Lolth, a fish. Lolth is not a fish, she is a rainbow whale, a dolphin, a mammal like humans. List wanted to say that. But when he thought of the magic in this world, the abundance of species far exceeded that of Earth, and it was even more magical. It seemed that there was no point in dividing them in detail. There was no need to investigate whether the rainbow whale was a fish or a dolphin. He waved his hand and motioned for Parker to play, then prepared to take out his magic masterpiece for Chi to study. But Chi was the first to speak. Brother, Chi found a group of large shell sea monsters at the bottom of the sea near the rocky island. When they opened their mouths, there was a large golden pearl inside. As she said that, she controlled the water flow and a light golden shell about the size of a wash basin swept over. Seeing the shell, List quickly cast magic eyes. He could clearly see that the shell was glowing with bright magic light. It was another shellfish sea monster. Brother, be careful. Can release magic water bomb. It's a little dangerous. Chi quickly added. However, there was no need to remind him about this. List, who had the eye of magic, could clearly see the flow of magic on the sea monster's body, and thus determine whether or not to release magic. He picked up the light golden shell and threw it into the room. Then he pulled out the sky-slashing greatsword, aimed at the gap in the shell and stabbed it in. The gap in the shell was very tightly closed and the closing force was very strong. However, List's dragon Chi revolved, forcibly stabbing the sky cutter greatsword in, and then with a forceful pry, the two pieces of shell fell apart in a split second. Even the flesh of the shell inside was torn apart. List didn't even cast a single spell before the golden shell was brutally killed by List. However, although it was dead, the golden pearl in its body was perfectly revealed. Using the blade of the sword to gently cut open the membrane that wrapped it, a round golden pearl that was as big as an adult man's fist blossomed with a brilliant luster, as if it was a ball made of pure gold. There was only one, but the rich bluish-white magic power already showed its value. This is probably the reward of the last smoke mission, a shell that produces pearls? List already understood in his heart that this group of shells that Chi found was the mission reward that came late. List looked at the dead shell. He found that the flesh inside the shell had golden lines in the gap, like lips. Golden lip clam. Golden pearl. It only took him 3 seconds to determine the name of the shell and the name of the pearl it produced. There were very few official records of sea monsters, and almost any sea monster encountered was a new species, and the naming rights were in the hands of the discoverer. Chi was this golden lip clam found on the seabed near Stony Island? As a woman, Chi's eyes sparkled as she looked at the pearl. Yes, brother, don't you think its pearl is beautiful? It's golden, as beautiful as the black pearl of the giant clam. It's really beautiful, but I don't know what its function is. I have to study it carefully. If the value is high, the territory will have another specialty. Even if the pearl is worthless, the sea monster meat is also very nutritious. Giant clam, pink conch, plus golden lip clam. All of them were specialties. Unfortunately, the technology to breed and mine them had not yet been explored. The fishermen could only do some auxiliary work or plant gravel for the giant clam. The serfs were powerless to deal with sea monsters like the pink conch that could release magic. To mine them, Chi or List had to do it themselves. The same was probably true for the golden lip clam. However, as long as the value of the golden pearl was great, List would not feel tired even if he had to mine it himself. List put the golden pearl aside for the time being. He took out his magic masterpiece, demonstration of the unification of triangle theory and magic formation structure, and handed it to Chi. This is my guess about the magic system. There may be some data misquoting or logic errors that I haven't found. Please help me refer to it. Okay. Chi was now a water-great mage. Although she had progressed by relying on her talent rather than on the accumulation of knowledge, she still read a lot of magic books seriously. Unlike List, who read magic books, he specifically picked those that recorded interesting stories. He gained a lot of interesting stories, but his knowledge was still half-baked. He no longer disturbed Chi's reading. He called Lolth and headed straight for the sea. According to the direction Chi had indicated, he was ready to go to the rocky island, find the group of golden lip clams and study them carefully. Since he had the 7-colored whale Lolth as a mount, List rode it into the sea almost every day to enjoy the magnificent scenery of the sea. For many people, the sea was an unknown forbidden area, always accompanied by all kinds of mysterious legends, unknown sea monsters and the dark abyss. Ordinary people did not dare to set foot in the sea easily. When he was searching for the giant algae forest, if it weren't for a cheese company, List would not have dared to go into the sea casually. But as the number of times he went into the sea increased, he had overcome his deep-sea phobia and fell in love with the feeling of galloping in the sea. The ecosystem that was completely different from that on land, the colorful fish, corals, aquatic plants and seabed creatures as well as sharks, turtles and so on, deeply attracted him. Even though the 7-colored whale was only a low-level dragon and had only one kind of magic, colorful breathing membrane, it was still a tyrant in the sea and not many could threaten it. There was no danger in the waters around Coral Island and Black Horse Island. Even if it encountered a group of huge sharks once, the 7-colored whale still bravely rushed up, knocked over one of them, easily tore open its abdomen and ate its liver. Then it scared away all the rest of the sharks. Even a humpback whale tens of meters long, when it saw the 7-colored whale, turned around and swam away, not daring to approach. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.